Chapter 16 of 17. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jonathan Burchard, June 2009. 17 by Booth Tarkington, Chapter 16, The Shower. She continued to be thoughtful until after lunch, when, upon the sun's disappearance behind a fat cloud, Jane and the heavens exchanged dispositions for the time. The heavens darkened, and Jane brightened. She was in the front hall when the sunshine departed rather abruptly, and she jumped for joy, pointing to the open door. "Looky! Looky there!" she called to her brother. Richly ornamented, he was descending the front stairs, his embellishments including freshly pressed white trousers, a new straw hat, unusual shoes, and a blasphemous tie. "I'm going to get to sail my boat!" Jane shouted. "It's going to rain!" "It is not," said William, irritated. "It's not going to anything like rain. I suppose you think it ought to rain just to let you sail that chunk of wood." "It's going to rain! It's going to rain!" Jane made a little sing-song chant of it. "It's going to rain. It gives Willie a pain. It's going to rain. It gives Willie a pain. It's going to—" He interrupted her sternly. "Look here! You're old enough to know better. I suppose you think there isn't anything as important in the world as your getting the chance to sail that little boat. I suppose you think business and everything else has got to stop and get ruined, maybe, just to please you." As he spoke, he walked to an umbrella stand in the hall and deliberately took therefrom a bamboo walking stick of his father's. Indeed, his denunciation of Jane's selfishness about the weather was made partly to reassure himself and settle his nerves, strained by the unusual procedure he contemplated, and partly to divert Jane's attention. In the latter effort he was unsuccessful. Her eyes became strange and unbearable. She uttered a shriek. "Willie's going to carry a cane!" "You hush up," he said fiercely, and hurried out through the front door. She followed him to the edge of the porch. She stood there while he made his way to the gate, and she continued to stand there as he went down the street, trying to swing the cane in an unaccustomed and unembarrassed manner. Jane made this difficult. "Willie's got a cane!" she screamed. "He's got Papa's cane!" Then, resuming her little chant, she began to sing. "It's going to rain! Willie's got Papa's cane! It's going to rain! Willie's got Papa's cane!" She put all her voice into a final effort. "Miss Pratt'll get wet if you don't take an umbrella!" The attention of several chance pedestrians had been attracted, and the burning William, breaking into an agonized half-trot, disappeared round the corner. Then Jane retired within the house, feeling that she had done her duty. It would be his own fault if he got wet. Rain was coming. Rain was in the feel of the air, and in Jane's hope. She was not disappointed. Mr. Genesis, so secure of fair weather in the morning, was proved by the afternoon to be a bad prophet. The fat cloud was succeeded by others, fatter. A corpulent army assailed the vault of heaven, heavy outriders before a giant of evil complexion and devastating temper. An hour after William had left the house, the dust in the streets and all loose paper and rubbish outdoors rose suddenly to a considerable height and started for somewhere else. The trees had colic. Everything became as dark as winter twilight. Streaks of wildfire ran miles in a second, and somebody seemed to be ripping up sheets of copper and tin the size of farms. The rain came with a swish, then with a rattle, and then with a roar, while people listened at their garret doorways and marveled. Window panes turned to running water. It poured. Then it relented, dribbled, shook down a last few drops, and passed on to the countryside. Windows went up. Eaves and full gutters plashed and gurgled. Clearer light fell. Then, in a moment, sunshine rushed upon shining green trees and green grass. Doors opened, and out came the children. Shouting, they ran to the flooded gutters. Here were rivers, lakes, and oceans for navigation, easy pilotage, for the steersman had but to wade beside his craft and guide it with a twig. Jane's timely boat was one of the first to reach the water. Her mother had been kind, and Jane, with shoes and stockings left behind her on the porch, was a happy sailor as she waded knee-deep along the brimming curbstones. At the corner below the house of the Baxters, the street was flooded clear across, and Jane's boat, following the current, proceeded gallantly onward here, sailed down the next block, and was thoughtlessly entering a sewer when she snatched it out of the water. Looking about her, she perceived a gutter which seemed even lovelier than the one she had followed. It was deeper and broader and perhaps a little browner, wherefore she launched her ship upon its dimpled bosom and explored it as far as the next sewer hole or portage. Thus the voyage continued for several blocks with only one accident, which might have happened to anybody. It was an accident in the nature of a fall, caused by the sliding of Jane's left foot on some slippery mud. This treacherous substance, covered with water, could not have been anticipated, and consequently Jane's emotions were those of indignation rather than of culpability. Upon rising, she debated whether or not she should return to her dwelling, inclining to the opinion that the authorities there would have taken the affirmative, but as she was wet not much above the waist, and the guilt lay all upon the mud, she decided that such an interruption of her journey would be a gross injustice to herself. Navigation was reopened. Presently, the boat wandered into a miniature whirlpool, grooved in a spiral and pleasant to see. Slowly the water went round and round, and so did the boat, without any assistance from Jane. Watching this movement thoughtfully, she brought forth from her drenched pocket some sodden whitish discs, recognizable as having been crackers, and began to eat them. Thus absorbed, she failed at first to notice the approach of two young people along the sidewalk. They were the entranced William and Miss Pratt, and their appearance offered a suggestive contrast in relative humidity. In charming and tender-colored fabrics, fluffy and cool and summery, she was specklessly dry. Not a drop had touched even the pink parasol over her shoulder. Not one had fallen upon the tiny white doglet drowsing upon her arm. But William was wet. He was still more than merely damp, though they had evidently walked some distance since the rain had ceased to fall. His new hat was a mucilaginous ruin. His dank coat sagged, his shapeless trousers flopped heavily, and his shoes gave forth marshy sounds as he walked. No brilliant analyst was needed to diagnose this case. Surely any observer must have said, "Here is a dry young lady, and at her side walks a wet young gentleman who carries an umbrella in one hand and a walking-stick in the other." Obviously the young lady and gentleman were out for a stroll for which the stick was sufficient, and they were caught by the rain. Before any fell, however, he found her a place of shelter, such as a corner drug-store, and then himself gallantly went forth into the storm for an umbrella. He went to the young lady's house, or to the house where she may be visiting, for if he had gone to his own he would have left his stick. It may be, too, that at his own his mother would have detained him, since he is still at the age when it is just possible sometimes for mothers to get their sons into the house when it rains. He returned with the umbrella to the corner drug-store at probably about the time when the rain ceased to fall, because his extreme moistness makes necessary the deduction that he was out in all the rain that rained. But he does not seem to care. The fact was that William did not even know that he was wet. With his head sideways and his entranced eyes continuously upon the pretty face so near, his state was almost somnambulistic. Not conscious of his soggy garments or of the deluged streets, he floated upon a rosy cloud, incense about him, far-away music enchanting his ears. If Jane had not recognized the modelling of his features, she might not have known them to be William's, for they had altered their grouping to produce an expression with which she was totally unfamiliar. To be explicit, she was unfamiliar with this expression in that place, that is to say, upon William, though she had seen something like it upon other people once or twice in church. William's thoughts might have seemed to her as queer as his expression, could she have known them. They were not very definite, however, taking the form of sweet, vague pictures of the future. These pictures were of married life, that is, married life as William conceived it for himself and Miss Pratt, something strikingly different from that he had observed as led by his mother and father, or their friends and relatives. In his rapt mind he beheld Miss Pratt walking beside him through life, with her little parasol and her little dog, her exquisite face always lifted playfully toward his own, with admiration underneath the playfulness, and he heard her voice of silver always rippling baby talk throughout all the years to come. He saw her applauding his triumphs, though these remained indefinite in his mind, and he was unable to foreshadow the business or profession which was to provide the amazing mansion, mainly conservatory, which he pictured as their home. Surrounded by flowers, and maintaining a private orchestra, he saw Miss Pratt and himself growing old together, attaining to such ages as 30 and even 35, still in perfect harmony, and always either dancing in the evenings or strolling hand in hand in the moonlight. Sometimes they would visit the nursery, where curly-headed, rosy cherubs played upon a white bear rug in the firelight. These were all boys and ready-made, the youngest being 3 years old and without a past. They would be beautiful children, happy with their luxurious toys on the bare rug, and they would never be seen in any part of the house except the nursery. Their deportment would be flawless, and Willie! The aviator struck a hole in the air. His heart misgave him. Then he came to earth, a sickening drop and instantaneous. Willie! There was Jane, a figurine in a plastic state and altogether disgraceful. She came up out of the waters and stood before them with feet of clay, indeed, pedestaled upon the curbstone. "Who is that curious child?" said Miss Pratt, stopping. William shuddered. "Was she calling you?" Miss Pratt asked incredulously. "Willie, I told you better take an umbrella," said Jane, "instead of Papa's cane," and she added triumphantly, "Now you see." Moving forward, she seemed to have in mind a dreadful purpose. There was something about her that made William think she intended casually to accompany him and Miss Pratt. "You go home," he commanded hoarsely. Miss Pratt uttered a little scream of surprise and recognition. "It's your little sister!" she exclaimed, and then, reverting to her favorite playfulness of enunciation, "Ur ickle sissa!" she exclaimed gaily as a translation. Jane misunderstood it. She thought Miss Pratt meant our little sister. "Go home," said William. "Naughty, naughty," said Miss Pratt, shaking her head. "Me 'fraid oo's a naughty ickle dirl, all dirty." Jane advanced. "I wish you'd let me carry Flopit for you," she said. Giving forth another gentle scream, Miss Pratt hopped prettily backward from Jane's extended hands. "Ooh, ooh!" she cried chidingly. "Mustn't touch. Pessish Flopit all soap water wash clean. Ickle dirly all muddy nassy. Ickle dirly must go home. Dat all soap and water wash clean like nice ickle sissa. Everybody will love ur ickle sissa den," she concluded, turning to William. "Tell ur ickle sissa must go home dat soap water wash." Jane stared at Miss Pratt with fixed solemnity during the delivery of these admonitions, and it was to be seen that they made an impression upon her. Her mouth slowly opened, but she spake not. An extraordinary idea had just begun to make itself at home in her mind. It was an idea which had been hovering in the neighborhood of that domain ever since William's comments upon the conversation of Mr. Genesis in the morning. "Go home," repeated William. And then, as Jane stood motionless and inarticulate, transfixed by her idea, he said, almost brokenly, to his dainty companion, "I don't know what you'll think of my mother, to let this child—" Miss Pratt laughed comfortingly as they started on again. "Is it Mamma's fault, foolish boy Baxter? Ickle dirlies will det daty." The profoundly mortified William glanced back over his shoulder, bestowing upon Jane a look in which bitterness was mingled with apprehension. But she remained where she was and did not follow. That was a little to be thankful for, and he found some additional consolation in believing that Miss Pratt had not caught the frightful words "Papa's cane" at the beginning of the interview. He was encouraged to this belief by her presently taking from his hand the decoration in question and examining it with tokens of pleasure. "Ooh, pitty walk tick," she called it, with a tact he failed to suspect. And so he began to float upward again. Glamours enveloped him, and the earth fell away. He was alone in space with Miss Pratt once more. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of 17. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jonathan Burchard, June 2009. 17 by Booth Tarkington. Chapter 17. Jane's Theory. The pale end of sunset was framed in the dining room windows, and Mr. and Mrs. Baxter and the rehabilitated Jane were at the table when William made his belated return from the afternoon's excursion. Seating himself, he waived his mother's references to the rain, his clothes, and probable colds, and after one laden glance at Jane denoting a grievance so elaborate that he despaired of setting it forth in a formal complaint to the powers, he fell into a state of trance. He took nourishment automatically, and roused himself but once during the meal, a pathetic encounter with his father resulting from this awakening. "Everybody in town seemed to be on the streets this evening as I walked home," Mr. Baxter remarked, addressing his wife. I suppose there's something in the clean air after a rain that brings 'em out. I noticed one thing, though. Maybe it's the way they dress nowadays, but you certainly don't see as many pretty girls on the streets as there used to be." William looked up absently. "I used to think that, too," he said with dreamy condescension, "when I was younger." Mr. Baxter stared. "Well, I'll be darned!" he said. "Papa, Papa," his wife called reprovingly. "When you were younger?" Mr. Baxter repeated, with considerable irritation. "How old do you think you are?" "I'm going on 18," said William firmly. "I know plenty of cases where—" He paused, relapsing into lethargy. "What's the matter with him?" Mr. Baxter inquired heatedly of his wife. William again came to life. "I was saying that a person's age is different according to circumstances," he explained with dignity, if not lucidity. "You take Genesis's father. Well, he was married when he was 16. Then there was a case over in Iowa that lots of people know about and nobody thinks anything of. A young man over there in Iowa that's 17 years old began shaving when he was 13 and shaved every day for 4 years, and now—" He was interrupted by his father, who was no longer able to contain himself. "And now I suppose he's got whiskers!" he burst forth. "There's an ambition for you! My soul!" It was Jane who took up the tale. She had been listening with growing excitement, her eyes fixed piercingly upon William. "He's got a beard!" she cried, alluding not to her brother, but to the fabled Iowan. "I heard Willie tell old Mr. Genesis about it." "It seems to lie heavily on your mind," Mr. Baxter said to William. "I suppose you feel that in the face of such an example, your life between the ages of 13 and 17 has been virtually thrown away." William had again relapsed, but he roused himself feebly. "Sir?" he said. "What is the matter with him?" Mr. Baxter demanded. "Half the time lately he seems to be hibernating and only responds by a slight twitching when poked with a stick. The other half of the time he either behaves like I don't know what or talks about children growing whiskers in Iowa. Hasn't that girl left town yet?" William was not so deep entranced that this failed to stir him. He left the table. Mrs. Baxter looked distressed, though, as the meal was about concluded, and William had partaken of his share in spite of his dreaminess, she had no anxieties connected with his sustenance. As for Mr. Baxter, he felt a little remorse, undoubtedly, but he was also puzzled. So plain a man was he that he had no perception of the callous brutality of the words "that girl" when applied to some girls. He referred to his mystification a little later, as he sat with his evening paper in the library. "I don't know what I said to that tetchy boy to hurt him," he began in an apologetic tone. "I don't see that there was anything too rough for him to stand in a little sarcasm. He needn't be so sensitive on the subject of whiskers, it seems to me." Mrs. Baxter smiled faintly and shook her head. It was Jane who responded. She was seated upon the floor, disporting herself mildly with her paint box. "Papa, I know what's the matter with Willie," she said. "Do you?" Mr. Baxter returned. "Well, if you make it pretty short, you've got just about long enough to tell us before your bedtime." "I think he's married," said Jane. "What?" And her parents united their hilarity. "I do think he's married," Jane insisted, unmoved. "I think he's married with that Miss Pratt." "Well," said her father, "he does seem upset, and it may be that her visit and the idea of whiskers coming so close together is more than mere coincidence. But I hardly think Willie is married, Jane." "Well, then," she returned thoughtfully, "he's almost married. I know that much, anyway." "What makes you think so?" "Well, because I kind of thought he must be married, or anyway somethin', when he talked to Mr. Genesis this mornin'. He said he knew how some people got married in Pennsylvania and India, and he said they were only 7 or 8 years old. He said so, and I heard him, and he said there were 11 people married that were only 17, and this boy in Iowa got a full beard and got married too. And he said Mr. Genesis was only 16 when he was married. He talked all about getting married when you're 17 years old, and he said how people thought it was the best thing could happen. So I just know he's almost married." Mr. Baxter chuckled, and Mrs. Baxter smiled, but a shade of thoughtfulness, a remote anxiety, fell upon the face of the latter. "You haven't any other reason, have you, Jane?" she asked. "Yes'm," said Jane promptly, "and it's more reason than any. Miss Pratt calls you Mama as if you were her mamma. She does it when she talks to Willie." "Jane!" "Yes'm, I heard her. And Willie said, 'I don't know what you'll think about Mother.' He said, 'I don't know what you'll think about Mother,' to Miss Pratt." Mrs. Baxter looked a little startled, and her husband frowned. Jane mistook their expressions for incredulity. "They did, Mama," she protested. "That's just the way they talk to each other. I heard 'em this afternoon when Willie had Papa's cane." "Maybe they were doing it to tease you if you were with them," Mr. Baxter suggested. "I wasn't with 'em. I was sailin' my boat, and they came along, and first they never saw me, and Willie looked oh, Papa, I wish you'd seen him." Jane rose to her feet in her excitement. "His face was so funny, you never saw anything like it. He was walkin' along with it turned sideways, and all the time he kept walkin' frontways. He kept his face sideways, like this, Papa. Look, Papa." And she gave what she considered a faithful imitation of William walking with Miss Pratt. "Look, Papa, this is the way Willie went. He had it sideways so's he could see Miss Pratt, Papa, and his face was just like this. Look, Papa." She contorted her features in a terrifying manner. "Look, Papa." "Don't, Jane!" her mother exclaimed. "Well, I have to show Papa how Willie looked, don't I?" said Jane, relaxing. "That's just the way he looked. Well, and then they stopped and talked to me, and Miss Pratt said, 'It's our little sister.'" "Did she really?" Mrs. Baxter asked gravely. "Yes'm, she did. Soon as she saw who I was, she said, 'Why, it's our little sister.' Only she said it the way she talks, sort of foolish. 'It's our little sissy.' Somep'n like that, Mama. She said it twice and told me to go home and get washed up. And Miss Pratt told Willie, Miss Pratt said, 'It isn't Mama's fault Jane's so dirty.' Just like that. Are you sure she said 'our little sister'?" said Mrs. Baxter. "Why, you can ask Willie. She said it that funny way. 'Or little sissy.' That's what she said. And Miss Pratt said, 'Everybody would love our little sister if Mama washed her in soap and water.' You can ask Willie. That's exactly what Miss Pratt said. And if you don't believe it, you can ask her. If you don't want to believe it, why, you can ask—" "Hush, dear," said Mrs. Baxter. "All this doesn't mean anything at all, especially such nonsense as Willie's thinking of being married. It's your bedtime." "Well, but Mama—" "Was that all they said?" Mr. Baxter inquired. Jane turned to him eagerly. "They said all lots of things like that, Papa. They—" "Nonsense!" Mrs. Baxter interrupted. "Come, it's bedtime. I'll go up with you. You mustn't think such nonsense." "But, Mama—" "Come along, Jane." Jane was obedient in the flesh, but her spirit was free. Her opinions were her own. Disappointed in the sensation she had expected to produce, she followed her mother out of the room wearing the expression of a person who says, "You'll see, some day when everything's ruined." Mr. Baxter, left alone, laughed quietly, lifted his neglected newspaper to obtain the light at the right angle, and then allowed it to languish upon his lap again. Frowning, he began to tap the floor with his shoe. He was trying to remember what things were in his head when he was 17, and it was difficult. It seemed to him that he had been a steady, sensible young fellow, really quite a man at that age. Looking backward at the blur of youthful years, the period from 16 to 25 appeared to him as pretty much all of a piece. He could not recall just when he stopped being a boy. It must have been at about 15, he thought. All at once he sat up stiffly in his chair, and the paper slid from his knee. He remembered one autumn, long ago, when he had decided to abandon the educational plans of his parents and become an actor. He had located this project exactly, for it dated from the night of his 17th birthday, when he saw John McCulloch play Virginius. Even now Mr. Baxter grew a little red as he remembered the remarkable letter he had written, a few weeks later, to the manager of a passing theatrical company. He had confidently expected an answer, and had made his plans to leave town quietly with the company and afterward reassure his parents by telegraph. In fact, he might have been on the stage at this moment if that manager had taken him. Mr. Baxter began to look nervous. Still, there is a difference between going on the stage and getting married. I don't know, though, Mr. Baxter thought, and Willie's certainly not so well balanced in a general way as I was. He wished his wife would come down and reassure him, though of course it was all nonsense. But when Mrs. Baxter came downstairs she did not reassure him. "Of course, Jane's too absurd," she said. "I don't mean that she made it up. She never does that. And no doubt this little Miss Pratt did say about what Jane thought she said. But it all amounts to nothing. Of course, Willie's just going through what several of the other boys about his age are going through, like Johnny Watson and Joe Bullitt and Wallace Banks. They all seem to be frantic over her. I caught a glimpse of her the day you had her to tea. She's rather pretty." "Adorably. And perhaps Willie has been just a little bit more frantic than the others. He certainly seems in a queer state." At this his wife's tone became serious. "Do you think he would do as crazy a thing as that?" Mr. Baxter laughed. "Well, I don't know what he'd do it on. I don't suppose he has more than $1 in his possession." "Yes, he has," she returned quickly. "Day before yesterday there was a second-hand furniture man here, and I was too busy to see him. But I wanted the storeroom in the cellar cleared out, and I told Willie he could have whatever the man would pay him for the junk in there, if he'd watch to see that they didn't take anything. They found some old pieces that I'd forgotten underneath things, and altogether the man paid Willie $9.85. "But mercy me!" exclaimed Mr. Baxter. "The girl may be an idiot, but she wouldn't run away and marry a boy just barely 17 on $9.85. "Oh, no," said Mrs. Baxter. "At least I don't think so. Of course, girls do as crazy things as boys sometimes, in their way. I was thinking—" She paused. "Of course, there couldn't be anything in it, but it did seem a little strange." "What did?" "Why, just before I came downstairs, Adelia came for the laundry, and I asked her if she'd seen Willie, and she said he'd put on his dark suit after dinner, and he went out through the kitchen, carrying his suitcase." "He did?" "Of course," Mrs. Baxter went on slowly, "I couldn't believe he'd do such a thing, but he really is in a preposterous way over this little Miss Pratt, and he did have that money." "By George!" Mr. Baxter got upon his feet. "The way he talked at dinner, I would come pretty near believing he hasn't any more brains left than to get married on $9.85. I wouldn't put it past him, by George, I wouldn't." "Well, I don't think he would," she remonstrated feebly. "Besides, the law wouldn't permit it." Mr. Baxter paced the floor. "Oh, I suppose they could manage it. They could go to some little town and give false ages and—" He broke off. "Adelia was sure he had his suitcase." She nodded. "Do you think we'd better go down to the Parchers? We'd just say we came to call, of course, and if—" "Get your hat on," he said. "I don't think there's anything in it at all, but we'd just as well drop down there. It can't hurt anything." "Of course, I don't think—" she began. "Neither do I," he interrupted irascibly. "But with a boy of his age crazy enough to think he's in love, how do we know what'll happen? We're only his parents. Get your hat on." But when the uneasy couple found themselves upon the pavement before the house of the Parchers, they paused under the shade trees in the darkness, and presently decided that it was not necessary to go in. Suddenly their uneasiness had fallen from them. From the porch came the laughter of several young voices, and then one silvery voice which pretended to be that of a tiny child.
"Oh, say, my new big brother Josie Joe. Must be polite to Johnny Jump Up, or tant play with May and Lola."
"That's Miss Pratt," whispered Mrs. Baxter. "She's talking to Johnny Watson and Joe Bullitt and May Parcher. Let's go home. It's all right. Of course I knew it would be." "Why, certainly," said Mr. Baxter as they turned. "Even if Willie were as crazy as that, the little girl would have more sense. I wouldn't have thought anything of it if you hadn't told me about the suitcase. That looked sort of queer." She agreed that it did, but immediately added that she had thought nothing of it. What had seemed more significant to her was William's interest in the early marriage of Genesis's father, and in the Iowa beard story, she said. Then she said that it was curious about the suitcase. And when they came to their own house again, there was William sitting alone and silent upon the steps of the porch. "I thought you'd gone out, Willie," said his mother, as they paused beside him. "Ma'am?" "Adelia said you went out, carrying your suitcase." "Oh, yes," he said languidly. "If you leave clothes at Schwartz's in the evening, they have 'em pressed in the morning. You said I looked damp at dinner, so I took 'em over and left 'em there." "I see." Mrs. Baxter followed her husband to the door, but she stopped on the threshold and called back. Don't sit there too long, Willie." "Ma'am?" "The dew is falling, and it rained so hard today. I'm afraid it might be damp." "Ma'am?" "Come on," Mrs. Baxter said to his wife. "He's down on the Parcher's porch, not out in front here. Of course he can't hear you. It's 3 blocks and a half." But William's father was mistaken. Little he knew. William was not upon the porch of the Parchers, with May Parcher and Joe Bullitt and Johnny Watson to interfere. He was far from there, in a land where time was not, upon a planet floating in pink mist and uninhabited, unless old Mr. Genesis and some Hindu princes and the diligent Iowan may have established themselves in its remoter regions. William was alone with Miss Pratt in the conservatory, and after a time they went together and looked into the door of a room where an indefinite number of little boys, all over 3 years of age, were playing in the firelight upon a white bear rug. For in the roseate gossamer that boys' dreams are made of, William had indeed entered the married state. His condition was growing worse every day. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of 17. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jonathan Burchard, July 2009. 17 by Booth Tarkington. Chapter 18. The Big Fat Lummox. In the morning sunshine, Mrs. Baxter stood at the top of the steps of the front porch, addressing her son, who listened impatiently and edged himself a little nearer the gate every time he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Willie," she said, "you must really pay some attention to the laws of health, or you'll never live to be an old man." "I don't want to live to be an old man," said William earnestly. "I'd rather do what I please now and die a little sooner." "You talk very foolishly," his mother returned. "Either come back and put on some heavier things, or take your overcoat." "My overcoat!" William groaned. "They'd think I was a lunatic carrying an overcoat in August." "Not to a picnic," she said. "Mother, it isn't a picnic. I've told you 100 times. You think it's one of those old-fashioned things you used to go to, sit on the damp ground and eat sardines with ants all over 'em. This isn't anything like that. We just go out on the trolley to this farmhouse and have noon dinner and dance all afternoon and have supper and then come home on the trolley. I guess we'd hardly have got up anything as out of date as a picnic in honor of Miss Pratt." Mrs. Baxter seemed unimpressed. "It doesn't matter whether you call it a picnic or not, Willie. It will be cool on the open trolley car coming home, especially with only those white trousers on." "Ye gods!" he cried. "I've got other things on besides my trousers. I wish you wouldn't always act as if I was a perfect child. Good heavens! Isn't a person my age supposed to know how much clothes to wear?" "Well, if he is," she returned, "it's a mere supposition and not founded on fact. Don't get so excited, Willie, please, but you'll either have to give up the picnic or come in and change my things," he wailed. "I can't change my things. I've got just 20 minutes to get to May Parcher's. The crowd meets there, and they're going to take the trolley in front of the Parchers at exactly 11:15. Please don't keep me any longer, Mother. I got to go." She stepped into the hall and returned immediately. "Here's your overcoat, Willie." His expression was of despair. "They'll think I'm a lunatic, and they'll say so before everybody. And I don't blame 'em. Overcoat on a hot day like this? Except me, I don't suppose there was ever anybody lived in the world and got to be going on 18 years and had to carry a silly old overcoat around with him in August, because his mother made him." "Willie," said Mrs. Baxter, "you don't know how many thousands and thousands of mothers for thousands and thousands of years have kept their sons from taking thousands and thousands of colds, just this way." He moaned. "Well, and I got to be called a lunatic just because you're nervous, I suppose. All right." She hung it upon his arm, kissed him, and he departed in a desperate manner. However, having worn his tragic face for 3 blocks, he halted before a corner drug-store and permitted his expression to improve as he gazed upon the window display of My Little Sweetheart All-Tobacco Cuban Cigarettes, the package of 20 for 10 cents. William was not a smoker, that is to say, he had made the usual boyhood experiments, Finding them discouraging, and though at times he considered it humorously man about town to say to a smoking friend, "Well, I'll tackle one of your old coffin nails," he had never made a purchase of tobacco in his life. But it struck him now that it would be rather debonair to disport himself with a package of little sweethearts upon the excursion. And the name! It thrilled him inexpressibly, bringing a tenderness into his eyes and a glow into his bosom. He felt that when he should smoke a little sweetheart, it would be a tribute to the ineffable visitor for whom this party was being given. It would bring her closer to him. His young brow grew almost stern with determination, for he made up his mind, on the spot, that he would smoke oftener in the future. He would become a confirmed smoker, and all his life he would smoke My Little Sweetheart all-tobacco Cuban cigarettes. He entered and managed to make his purchase in a matter-of-fact way, as if he were doing something quite unemotional. Then he said to the clerk, "Oh, by the way, The clerk stared. "Well, what else?" "I mean," said William hurriedly, "there's something I wanted to tend to, now I happen to be here. I was on my way to take this overcoat to get something altered at the tailor's for next winter. Of course, I wouldn't want it till winter, but I thought I might as well get it done." He paused, laughing carelessly for greater plausibility. "I thought he'd probably want lots of time on the job. He's a slow worker, I've noticed, and so I decided I might just as well go ahead and let him get at it. Well, so I was on my way there, but I just noticed I only got about 6 minutes more to get to a mighty important engagement I got this morning, and I'd like to leave it here and come by and get it on my way home this evening." "Sure," said the clerk. "Hang it on that hook inside the prescription counter. There's one there already. Belongs to your friend, that young Bullitt fella. He was in here a while ago, and said he wanted to leave his because he didn't have time to take it to be pressed in time for next winter. Then he went on and joined that crowd in Mr. Parcher's yard round the corner that's goin' on a trolley party. I says, 'Bet your mother made you carry it,' and he says, 'Oh, no,' he says. 'Honest, I was going to get it pressed. You can hang yours on the same nail.'" The clerk spoke no more, and went to serve another customer, while William stared after him a little uneasily. It seemed that here was a man of suspicious nature, though, of course, Joe Bullitt's shallow talk about getting an overcoat pressed before winter would not have imposed upon anybody. However, William felt strongly that the private life of the customers of a store should not be pried into and speculated about by employees, and he was conscious of a distaste for this clerk. Nevertheless, it was with a lighter heart that he left his overcoat behind him and stepped out of the side door of the drugstore. That brought him within sight of the gaily dressed young people, about 30 in number, gathered upon the small lawn beside Mr. Parcher's house. Miss Pratt stood among them, in heliotrope and white, Flopit nestling in her arms. She was encircled by girls who were enthusiastically caressing the bored and blinking Flopit, and when William beheld this charming group, his breath became eccentric, his kneecaps became cold and convulsive, his neck became hot, and he broke into a light perspiration. She saw him. The small blonde head and the delirious little fluffy hat above it shimmered a nod to him. Then his mouth fell unconsciously open, and his eyes grew glassy with the intensity of meaning he put into the silent response he sent across the picket fence and through the interstices of the intervening group. Pressing with his elbow upon the package of cigarettes in his pocket, he murmured inaudibly, "My little sweetheart, always for you," a repetition of his vow that, come what might, he would forever remain a loyal smoker of that symbolic brand. In fact, William's mental condition had never shown one moment's turn for the better since the fateful day of the distracting visitor's arrival. Mr. Johnny Watson and Mr. Joe Bullitt met him at the gate and offered him hearty greeting. All bickering and dissension among these three had passed. The lady was so wondrous impartial that as time went on the sufferers had come to be drawn together, rather than thrust asunder by their common feeling. It had grown to be a bond uniting them. They were not so much rivals as ardent novices serving a single altar, each worshipping there without visible gain over the other. Each had even come to possess, in the eyes of his two fellows, almost a sacredness as a sharer in the celestial glamour. They were tender one with another. They were in the last stages. Johnny Watson had with him today a visitor of his own, a vastly overgrown person of 18, who, at Johnny's beckoning, abandoned a fair companion of the moment and came forward as William entered the gate. "I want to introduce you to two of my most intimate friends, George," said Johnny, with the anxious gravity of a person about to do something important and unfamiliar. "Mr. Baxter, let me introduce my cousin, Mr. Crooper. Mr. Crooper, this is my friend, Mr. Baxter." The gentleman shook hands solemnly, saying, "I'm very glad to meet you." And Johnny turned to Joe Bullitt. Mr. Bullitt, let me introduce my friend, Mr. Crooper. My cousin, Mr. Crooper. Mr. Crooper is a cousin of mine." "Glad to make your acquaintance, Mr. Crooper," said Joe. "I suppose you're a cousin of Johnny's, then?" "Yep," said Mr. Crooper, becoming more informal. "Johnny wrote me to come over for this shindig, so I thought I might as well come." He laughed loudly, and the others laughed with the same heartiness. "Yes, sir," he added. "I thought I might as well come, 'cause I'm pretty apt to be on hand if there's anything doing." "Well, that's right," said William, and while they all laughed again, Mr. Crooper struck his cousin a jovial blow upon the back. "Hi, old sport!" he cried. "I want to meet that Miss Pratt before we start. The car'll be along pretty soon, and I got her picked for the girl I'm going to sit by." The laughter of William and Joe Bullitt, designed to express cordiality, suddenly became flaccid and died. If Mr. Crooper had been a sensitive person, he might have perceived the chilling disapproval in their glances, for they had just begun to be most unfavorably impressed with him. The careless loudness, almost the notoriety, with which he had uttered Miss Pratt's name, demanding loosely to be presented to her, regardless of the well-known law that a lady must first express some wish in such matters. These were indications of a coarse nature sure to be more than uncongenial to Miss Pratt. Its presence might make the whole occasion distasteful to her, might spoil her day. Both William and Joe Bullitt began to wonder why on earth Johnny Watson didn't have any more sense than to invite such a big fat lummox of a cousin to the party. This severe phrase of theirs, almost simultaneous in the two minds, was not wholly a failure as a thumbnail sketch of Mr. George Crooper. And yet there was the impressiveness of size about him, especially about his legs and chin. At 17 and 18 growth is still going on, sometimes in a sporadic way, several parts seeming to have sprouted faster than others. Often the features have not quite settled down together in harmony, a mouth, for instance, appearing to have gained such a lead over the rest of a face that even a mother may fear it can never be overtaken. Voices, too, often seem misplaced. One hears, outside the door, the bass rumble of a sinister giant, and a mild boy, thin as a cricket, walks in. The contrary was George Crooper's case. His voice was an unexpected piping tenor, half falsetto and frequently girlish, as surprising as the absurd voice of an elephant. He had the general outwardness of a vast and lumpy child. His chin had so distanced his other features that his eyes, nose, and brow seemed almost baby-like in comparison, while his mountainous legs were the great part of the rest of him. He was one of those huge, bottle-shaped boys who are always in motion in spite of their cumbersomeness. His gestures were continuous, though difficult to interpret as bearing upon the subject of his equally continuous conversation, and under all circumstances he kept his conspicuous legs incessantly moving, whether he was going anywhere or remaining in comparatively one spot. His expression was pathetically offensive, the result of his bland confidence in the audible opinions of a small town whereof his father was the richest inhabitant. And the one thing about him, even more obvious than his chin, his legs, and his spectacular taste in flannels, was his perfect trust that he was as welcome to every one as he was to his mother. This might some day lead him in the direction of great pain, but on the occasion of the subscription party for Miss Pratt, it gave him an advantage. "When do I get to meet that cutie?" he insisted, as Johnny Watson moved backward from the cousinly arm, which threatened further flailing. "You introduced me to about 7 I can't do much for, but I want to get the howdy business over with this Miss Pratt, so I and she can get things started. I'm going to keep her busy all day." "Well, don't be in such a hurry," said Johnny uneasily. "You can meet her when we get out in the country. If I get a chance, George." "No, sir," George protested jovially. "I guess you're sad birds over in this town, but look out. When I hit a town, it don't take long till they all hear there's something doin'. You know how I am when I get started, Johnny." Here he turned upon William, tucking his fat arm affectionately through William's thin one. "Hi, sport! Oh, Johnny's so slow. You toddle me over and get me fixed up with this Miss Pratt, and I'll tell her you're the real stuff, after we get engaged." He was evidently a true cloud compeller, this horrible George. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of 17. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jonathan Burchard, July 2009. 17 by Booth Tarkington. Chapter 19. I dunno why it is. William extricated his arm, huskily muttering words which were lost in the general outcry. "Car's coming!" The young people poured out through the gate, and as the car stopped, scrambled aboard. For a moment, everything was hurried and confused. William struggled anxiously to push through to Miss Pratt and climb up beside her, but Mr. George Crooper made his way into the crowd in a beaming, though bull-like manner, and a fat back in a purple and white blazer flattened William's nose, while ponderous heels damaged William's toes, and just managed to clamber upon the footboard as the car started. The friendly hand of Joe Bullitt pulled him to a seat, and William found himself rubbing his nose and sitting between Joe and Johnny Watson, directly behind the dashing Crooper and Miss Pratt. Mr. Crooper had already taken Flopit upon his lap. "Dogs are always crazy 'bout me," they heard him say, for his high voice was but too audible over all other sounds. "Dogs and children. I don't know why it is, but they always take to me. My name's George Crooper III, Johnny Watson's cousin. He was trying to introduce me before the car came along, but he never got the chance. I guess as this shindig's for you, and I'm the only other guest from out of town, we'll have to introduce ourselves, the two guests of honor, as it were." Miss Pratt laughed her silvery laugh, murmured politely, and turned no freezing glance upon her neighbor. Indeed, it seemed that she was far from regarding him with the distaste anticipated by William and Joe Bullitt.
"Flopit looks so tooted-tunnin'," she was heard to remark. "Flopit looks so idle on dray big 'normous man's lap."
Mr. Crooper laughed deprecatingly. "He does look kind of small compared to the good old man that's got charge of him now. Well, I always was a good deal bigger than the fellows I went with. I don't know why it is, but I was always kind of quicker, too, as it were, and the strongest in any crowd I ever got with. I'm kind of muscle-bound, I guess, but I don't let that interfere with my quickness any. Take me in an automobile. Now, I got a racin' car at home, and I keep my head better than most people do, as it were. I can kind of handle myself better. I don't know why it is. My brains seem to work better than other people's. That's all it is. I don't mean that I got more sense or anything like that. It's just the way my brains work. They kind of put me at an advantage, as it were. Well, for instance, if I'd been living in this town and joined in with the crowd to get up this party, well, it would have been done a good deal different. I won't say better, but different. That's always the way with me if I go into anything. Pretty soon I'm running the whole shebang. I don't know why it is. The other people might try to run it their way for a while, but pretty soon you notice 'em beginning to step out of the way for good old George. I don't know why it is, but that's the way it goes. Well, if I'd been running this party, I'd have had automobiles to go out in, not a trolley car where you all got to sit together. I'd have sent over home for my little racer, and I'd have taken you out in her myself. I wish I'd sent for it anyway. We could have let the rest go out in the trolley, and you and I could have got off by ourselves. I'd like you to see that little car. Well, anyway, I bet you'd have seen something pretty different and a whole lot better if I'd have come over to this town in time to get up this party for you."
"For us," Miss Pratt corrected him sunnily. "Both strangers. Party for us, too, all both."
And she gave him one of her looks. Mr. Crooper flushed with emotion. He was annexed. He became serious. "Say," he said, "that's a mighty smooth hat you got on." And he touched the fluffy rim of it with his forefinger. His fat shoulders leaned toward her yearningly. "We'd certainly have had a lot better time sizzling along in that little racer I got," he said. "I'd like to had you see how I handle that little car. Girls over home, they say they like to go out with me just to watch the way I handle her. They say it ain't so much just the ride, but more the way I handle that little car. I don't know why it is, but that's what they say. That's the way I do anything I make up my mind to tackle, though. I don't try to tackle everything. There's lots of things I wouldn't take enough interest in 'em, as it were, but just let me make up my mind once, and it's all off. I don't know why it is. There was a brakeman on the train got kind of fresh. He didn't know who I was. Well, I just put my hand on his shoulder and pushed him down in his seat like this, and he set his hand upon Miss Pratt's shoulder. I didn't want to hit him, because there was women and children in the car, so I just shoved my face up close to him like this. 'I guess you don't know how much stock my father's got in this road,' I says. 'Did he, Wilt?' 'Well, you ought to have seen that brakeman when I got through telling him who I was.'"
"Nasty old brakeman,"
said Miss Pratt with unfailing sympathy. Mr. Crooper's fat hand, as if unconsciously, gave Miss Pratt's delicate shoulder a little pat in reluctant withdrawal. "Well, that's the way with me," he said. "Much as I've been around this world, nobody ever tried to put anything over on me and got away with it. They always come out the little end of the horn. I don't know why it is. Say, that's a mighty smooth locket you got on the end of that chain hit there." And again stretching forth his hand in a proprietor-like way, he began to examine the locket. 3 hot hearts, just behind, pulsated hatred toward him, for Johnny Watson had perceived his error, and his sentiments were now linked to those of Joe Bullitt and William. The unhappiness of these 3 helpless spectators was the more poignant because not only were they witnesses of the impression of greatness which George Crooper was obviously producing upon Miss Pratt, but they were unable to prevent themselves from being likewise impressed. They were not analytical. They dumbly accepted George at his own rating, not even being able to charge him with a lack of modesty. Did he not always accompany his testimonials to himself with his deprecating falsetto laugh and "I don't know why it is," an official disclaimer of merit, as it were? Here was a formidable candidate indeed, a traveler, a man of the world, with brains better and quicker than other people's brains, an athlete, yet knightly. He would not destroy even a brakeman in the presence of women and children. And finally, most enviable and deadly, the owner and operator of a little racer. All this glitter was not far short of overpowering, and yet, though accepting it as fact, the woeful 3 shared the inconsistent belief that in spite of everything, George was nothing but a big fat lummox. For thus they even rather loudly whispered of him, almost as if hopeful that Miss Pratt, and maybe George himself, might overhear. Impotent their seething, the overwhelming Crooper pursued his conquering way. He leaned more and more toward the magnetic girl, his growing tenderness having that effect upon him, and his head inclining so far that his bedewed brow now and then touched the fluffy hat. He was constitutionally restless, but his movements never ended by placing a greater distance between himself and Miss Pratt, though they sometimes discommoded Miss Parcher, who sat at the other side of him, a side of him which appeared to be without consciousness. He played naively with Miss Pratt's locket and with the filmy border of her collar. He flicked his nose for some time with her little handkerchief, loudly sniffing its scent, and finally he became interested in a ring she wore, removed it, and tried unsuccessfully to place it upon one of his own fingers. "I've worn lots of girls' rings on my watch fob. I'd let 'em wear mine on a chain or something. I guess they like to do that with me," he said. "I dunno why it is." At this subtle hint the 3 unfortunates held their breath, and then lost it as the lovely girl acquiesced in the horrible exchange. As for William, life was of no more use to him. Out of the blue heaven of that bright morning's promise had fallen a pall, draping his soul in black and purple. He had been horror-stricken when first the pudgy finger of George Crooper had touched the fluffy edge of that sacred little hat. Then, during George's subsequent pawings and leanings, William felt that he must either rise and murder or go mad. But when the exchange of rings was accomplished, his spirit broke and even resentment oozed away. For a time there was no room in him for anything except misery. Dully, William's eyes watched the fat shoulders hitching and twitching, while the heavy arms flourished in gesture and in further pawings. Again and again were William's ears afflicted with, "I dunno why it is," following upon tribute after tribute paid by Mr. Crooper to himself, and received with little cries of admiration and sweet child words on the part of Miss Pratt. It was a long and accursed ride. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of 17. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jonathan Burchard, July 2009. 17 by Booth Tarkington, Chapter 20, Sidney Carton. At the farmhouse where the party were to dine, Miss Pratt with joy discovered a harmonium in the parlor, and seating herself, with all the girls, Flopit, and Mr. George Crooper gathered around her, she played an accompaniment while George, in a thin tenor of detestable sweetness, sang "I'm Falling in Love with Someone." His performance was rapturously greeted, especially by the accompanist.
"Oh, wonderfulest Uncle Georgicums!"
she cried, for that was now the gentleman's name.
"If Johnny McCormick hear Uncle Georgicums, he go shoot himself dead. Bang!"
She looked round to where three figures hovered morosely in the rear.
"Turn on, sing chorus, Big Brother Josie Joe, Johnny Jump Up, and Eagle Boy Baxter, all over again. Uncle Georgicums, boys and girls, all sing chorus. Commence!"
And so the heart-rending performance continued until it was stopped by Wallace Banks, the altruistic and perspiring youth who had charge of the subscription list for the party and the consequent collection of assessments. This entitled Wallace to look haggard and to act as master of ceremonies. He mounted a chair. "Ladies and gentlemen," he bellowed, "I want to say, I am requested to announce that before dinner we're all supposed to take a walk around the farm and look at things, as this is supposed to be kind of a model farm, or supposed to be something like that. There's a Swedish lady named Anna going to show us around. She's out in the yard waiting, so please follow her to inspect the farm." To inspect a farm was probably the least of William's desires. He wished only to die in some quiet spot, and to have Miss Pratt told about it in words that would show her what she had thrown away. But he followed with the others, in the wake of the Swedish lady named Anna, and as they stood in the cavernous hollow of the great barn, he found his condition suddenly improved. Miss Pratt turned to him unexpectedly and placed Flopit in his arms.
"Keep precious Flopit cozy," she whispered. "Flopit love old friends best."
William's heart leaped, while a joyous warmth spread all over him. And though the execrable lummox immediately propelled Miss Pratt forward by her elbow to hear the descriptive remarks of the Swedish lady named Anna, William's soul remained uplifted and entranced. She had not said "like," she had said "Flopit love old friends best." William pressed forward valiantly, and placed himself as close as possible upon the right of Miss Pratt, the lummox being upon her left. A moment later, William wished that he had remained in the rear. This was due to the unnecessary frankness of the Swedish lady named Anna, who was briefly pointing out the efficiency of various agricultural devices, her attention being diverted by some effusions of pride on the part of a passing hen. She thought fit to laugh and say, "She just laid a egg." William shuddered. This grossness in the presence of Miss Pratt was unthinkable. His mind refused to deal with so impossible a situation. He could not accept it as a fact that such words had actually been uttered in such a presence, and yet it was the truth. His incredulous ears still sizzled. "She just laid egg." His entire skin became flushed. His averted eyes glazed themselves with shame. He was not the only person shocked by the ribaldry of the Swedish lady named Anna. Joe Bullitt and Johnny Watson, on the outskirts of the group, went to Wallace Banks, drew him aside, and with feverish eloquence set his responsibilities before him. It was his duty, they urged, to have an immediate interview with this free-spoken Anna and instruct her in the proprieties. Wallace had been almost as horrified as they by her loose remark, but he declined the office they proposed for him, offering, however, to appoint them as a committee with authority in the matter, whereupon they retorted with unreasonable indignation, demanding to know what he took them for. Unconscious of the embarrassment she had caused in these several masculine minds, the Swedish lady named Anna led the party onward, continuing her agricultural lecture. William walked mechanically, his eyes averted and looking at no one. And throughout this agony he was burningly conscious of the blasphemed presence of Miss Pratt beside him. Therefore, it was with no little surprise, when the party came out of the barn, that William beheld Miss Pratt, not walking at his side, but on the contrary, sitting too cozily with George Crooper upon a fallen tree at the edge of a peach orchard just beyond the barnyard. It was Mr Parcher who had been walking beside him, for the truant couple had made their escape at the beginning of the Swedish lady's discourse. In vain William murmured to himself, "Flopit love old friends best," Purple and black again descended upon his soul, for he could not disguise from himself the damnatory fact that George had flitted with the lady, while he, wretched William, had been permitted to take care of the dog. A spark of dignity still burned within him. He strode to the barnyard fence, and, leaning over it, dropped Flopit rather brusquely at his mistress's feet. Then, without a word, even without a look, William walked haughtily away, continuing his stern progress straight through the barnyard gate, and thence onward until he found himself in solitude upon the far side of a smoke-house, where his hauteur vanished. Here, in the shade of a great walnut tree which sheltered the little building, he gave way, not to tears certainly, but to faint murmurings and little heavings under impulses as ancient as young love itself. It is to be supposed that William considered his condition a lonely one. But if all the 17-year-olds who had known such half-hours could have shown themselves to him then, he would have fled from the mere horror of the billions. Alas, he considered his sufferings a new invention of the world, and there was now inspired in his breast a monologue so eloquently bitter that it might deserve some such title as A Passion Beside the Smoke-House. During the little time that William spent in this sequestration, he passed through phases of emotion which would have kept an older man busy for weeks and left him wrecked at the end of them. William's final mood was one of beautiful resignation with a kick in it. That is, he nobly gave her up to George and added irresistibly that George was a big fat lummox. Painting pictures, such as the billions of other young sufferers before him have painted, William saw himself a sad, gentle old bachelor at the family fireside, sometimes making the sacrifice of his reputation so that she and the children might never know the truth about George, and he gave himself the solace of a fierce scene or two with George. "Remember, it is for them, not you, you thing!" After this human little reaction, he passed to a higher field of romance. He would die for George, and then she would bring the little boy she had named William to the lonely headstone. Suddenly William saw himself in his true and fitting character. Sidney Carton. He had lately read A Tale of Two Cities, immediately rereading until, as he would have said, he knew it by heart. And even at the time he had seen resemblances between himself and the appealing figure of Carton. Now that the sympathy between them was perfected by Miss Pratt's preference for another, William decided to mount the scaffold in place of George Crooper. The scene became actual to him, and setting one foot upon a tin milk pail which someone had carelessly left beside the smoke-house, he lifted his eyes to the pitiless blue sky and unconsciously assumed the familiar attitude of Carton on the steps of the guillotine. He spoke aloud those great last words. "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to." A whiskered head on the end of a long corrugated red neck protruded from the smoke-house door. "What say?" it inquired huskily. Nothing," stammered William. Eyes above whiskers became fierce. "You take your feet off that milk bucket! Say, this here's a sanitary farm. Ain't you got any more sense than to go and—" But William had abruptly removed his foot and departed. He found the party noisily established in the farmhouse, as two long tables piled with bucolic viands already being violently depleted. Johnny Watson had kept a chair beside himself vacant for William. Johnny was in no frame of mind to sit beside any chattering girl, and he had protected himself by Joe Bullitt upon his right and the empty seat upon his left. William took it and gazed upon the nearer foods with a slight renewal of animation. He began to eat. He continued to eat. In fact, he did well. So did his two comrades. Not that the melancholy of these three was dispersed. Far from it. With ineffaceable gloom they ate chicken, both white meat and dark, drumsticks, wishbones, and livers. They ate corn on the cob, many ears, and fried potatoes and green peas and string beans. They ate peach preserves and apricot preserves and preserved pears. They ate biscuits with grape jelly and biscuits with crab-apple jelly. They ate apple sauce and apple butter and apple pie. They ate pickles, both cucumber pickles and pickles made of watermelon rind. They ate pickled tomatoes, pickled peppers, and also pickled onions. They ate lemon pie. At that, they were no rivals to George Crooper, who was a real eater. Love had not made his appetite ethereal today, and even the attending Swedish lady named Anna felt some apprehensions when it came to George and the gravy, though she was accustomed to the prodigies performed in this line by the robust hands on the farm. George laid waste his section of the table, and from the beginning he allowed himself scarce time to say, "I dunno why it is." The pretty companion at his side at first gazed dumbfounded. Then, with growing enthusiasm for what promised to be a really magnificent performance, she began to utter little ejaculations of wonder and admiration. With this music in his ears, George outdid himself. He could not resist the temptation to be more and more astonishing as a heroic comedian, for these humours sometimes came upon vain people at country dinners. George ate when he had eaten more than he needed. He ate long after everyone understood why he was so vast. He ate on, sheerly as a flourish, as a spectacle. He ate even when he himself began to understand that there was daring in what he did, for his was a toreador spirit, so long as he could keep bright eyes fastened upon him. Finally, he ate to decide wagers made upon his gorging, though at times during this last period his joviality deserted him. Anon, his damp brow would be troubled, and he knew moments of thoughtfulness. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of 17. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jonathan Burchard, July 2009. 17 by Booth Tarkington, Chapter 21, My Little Sweethearts. When George did stop, it was abruptly, during one of these intervals of sobriety, and he and Miss Pratt came out of the house together rather quietly, joining one of the groups of young people chatting with after-dinner languor under the trees. However, Mr. Crooper began to revive presently, in the sweet air of outdoors, and observing some of the more flashing gentlemen lighting cigarettes, he was moved to laughter. He had not smoked since his childhood, having then been bonded through to 21 with a pledge of gold, and he feared that these smoking youths might feel themselves superior. Worse, Miss Pratt might be impressed. Therefore he laughed in scorn, saying, "Burning up old trash around here, I expect." He sniffed searchingly. "Somebody set some old rags on fire." Then, as in discovery, he cried, "Oh, no, only cigarettes." Miss Pratt, that tactful girl, counted 4 smokers in the group about her, and only 1 abstainer, George. She at once defended the smokers, for it is to be feared that numbers always had weight with her.
"Oh, but cigarettes is lovely smell," she said. "Until Georgie comes maybe be too little boy for smokings."
This archness was greeted loudly by the smokers, and Mr. Crooper was put upon his mettle. He spoke too quickly to consider whether or no the facts justified his assertion. "Me? I don't smoke paper on old carpets. I smoke cigars." He had created the right impression, for Miss Pratt clapped her hands. "Oh, splendid! Light one until Georgie comes. Light one ever and ever so quick. Precious Floppet and me, we want to see dray big 'normous men smoke dray big 'normous cigar." William and Johnny Watson, who had been hovering morbidly, unable to resist the lodestone, came nearer, Johnny being just in time to hear his cousin's reply. I forgot my cigar case." Johnny's expression became one of biting skepticism. "What you talking about, George? Didn't you promise Uncle George you'd never smoke till you're of age? And Uncle George said he'd give you $1,000 on your 21st birthday? What did you say about your cigar case?" George felt that he was in a tight place, and the lovely eyes of Miss Pratt turned upon him questioningly. He could not flush, for he was already so pink after his exploits with unnecessary nutriment that more pinkness was impossible. He saw that the only safety for him lay in boisterous prevarication. $1,000! He laughed loudly. "I thought that was real money when I was 10 years old. It didn't stand in my way very long, I guess. Good old George wanted his smoke, and he went after it. You know how I am, Johnny, when I go after anything. I've been smoking cigars I don't know how long." Glancing about him, his eye became reassured. It was obvious that even Johnny had accepted this airy statement as the truth, and to clinch plausibility he added, "When I smoke, I smoke. I smoke cigars straight along, light one right off the stub of the other. I only wish I had some with me, because I miss 'em after a meal. I'd give a good deal for something to smoke right now. I don't mean cigarettes. I don't want any paper. I want something that's all tobacco." William's pale, sad face showed a hint of color. With a pang, he remembered the package of My Little Sweetheart all-tobacco Cuban cigarettes, the package of 20 for 10 cents, which still reposed untouched in the breast pocket of his coat. His eyes smarted a little as he recalled the thoughts and hopes that had accompanied the purchase, but he thought, what would Sidney Carton do? William brought forth the package of My Little Sweetheart all-tobacco Cuban cigarettes and placed it in the large hand of George Crooper. And this was a noble act, for William believed that George really wished to smoke. "Here," he said, "take these. They're all tobacco. I'm going to quit smoking anyway." And thinking of the name, he added gently, with a significance lost upon all his hearers, "I'm sure you ought to have 'em instead of me." Then he went away and sat alone upon the fence.
Light one," cried Miss Pratt. "Everybody must be happy, and Dre big 'normous man can't be happy unless he has his all tobacco smoked. Light it!"
George drew as deep a breath as his diaphragm, strangely oppressed since dinner, would permit, and then bravely lit a little sweetheart. There must have been some valiant blood in him, for as he exhaled the smoke, he covered a slight choking by exclaiming loudly, "That's good! That's the old stuff! That's what I was looking for!" Miss Pratt was entranced.
"Oh, splendid!" she cried,
watching him with fascinated eyes.
"Now take Dre big 'normous puffs! Take Dre big 'normous puffs!"
George took great big enormous puffs. She declared that she loved to watch men smoke, and William's heart, as he sat on the distant fence, was wrung and wrung again by the vision of her playful ecstasies. But when he saw her holding what was left of his first little sweetheart for George to light a second at its expiring spark, he could not bear it. He dropped from the fence and moped away to be out of sight once more. This was his darkest hour. Studiously avoiding the vicinity of the smokehouse, he sought the little orchard where he had beheld her sitting with George, and there he sat himself in sorrowful reverie upon the selfsame fallen tree. How long he remained there is uncertain, but he was roused by the sound of music which came from the lawn before the farmhouse. Bitterly he smiled, remembering that Wallace Banks had engaged Italians with harp, violin, and flute, promising great things for dancing on a fresh-clipped lawn, a turf floor being no impediment to 17's dancing. Music! To see her whirling and smiling sunnily in the fat grasp of that dancing bear! He would stay in this lonely orchard. She would not miss him. But though he hated the throbbing music and the sound of the laughing voices that came to him, he could not keep away. And when he reached the lawn where the dancers were, he found Miss Pratt moving rhythmically in the thin grasp of Wallace Banks. Johnny Watson approached and spoke in a low tone, tinged with spiteful triumph. "Well, anyway, old fat George didn't get the first dance with her. She's the guest of honor, and Wallace had a right to it because he did all the work. He came up to him, and old fat George couldn't say a thing. Wallace just took her right away from him. George didn't say anything at all, but I suppose after this dance he'll be rushing around again, and nobody else will have a chance to get near her the rest of the afternoon. My mother told me I ought to invite him over here, but I had no business to do it. He don't know the first principles of how to act in a town he don't live in." "Where'd he go?" William asked listlessly, for Mr. Crooper was nowhere in sight. "I don't know. He just walked off without saying anything. But he'll be back, time this dance is over, never you fear, and he'll grab her again and— What's the matter with Joe?" Joseph Bullitt had made his appearance at a corner of the house, some distance from where they stood. His face was alert under the impulse of strong excitement, and he beckoned fiercely. "Come here!" And when they had obeyed, "He's around back of the house by a kind of shed," said Joe. "I think something's wrong. Come on, I'll show him to you." But behind the house, whither they followed him in vague, strange hope, he checked them. "Look there!" he said. His pointing finger was not needed. Sounds of paroxysm drew their attention sufficiently, sounds most poignant, soul-rending, and lugubrious. William and Johnny perceived the large person of Mr. Crooper. He was seated upon the ground, his back propped obliquely against the smokehouse, though this attitude was not maintained constantly. Facing him, at a little distance, a rugged figure in homely garments stood leaning upon a hoe and regarding George with cold interest. The apex of this figure was a volcanic straw hat, triangular in profile and coned with an open crater emitting reddish wisps, while below the hat were several features, but more whiskers, at the top of a long, corrugated red neck of sterling worth. A husky voice issued from the whiskers, addressing George. "I seen you," it said. "I seen you eatin'. This here farm is supposed to be a sanitary farm, and you'd ought have knew better. Go it, doggone you, go it!" George complied, and 3 spectators, remaining aloof, but watching zealously, began to feel their lost faith in Providence returning into them. Their faces brightened slowly, and without relapse. It was a visible thing how the world became fairer and better in their eyes during that little while they stood there. And William saw that his little sweethearts had been an inspired purchase. After all, they had delivered the final tap upon a tottering edifice. George's deeds at dinner had unsettled, but little sweethearts had overthrown, and now there was awful work among the ruins to an ironical accompaniment of music from the front yard where people danced in heaven's sunshine. This accompaniment came to a stop, and Johnny Watson jumped. He seized each of his companions by a sleeve and spoke eagerly, his eyes glowing with a warm and brotherly light. "Here," he cried, "we better get around there. This looks like it was going to last all afternoon. Joe, you get the next dance with her, and just about the time the music slows up, you dance her around so you can stop right near where Bill will be standin', so Bill can get her quick for the dance after that. Then, Bill, you do the same for me, and I'll do the same for Joe again, and then, Joe, you do it for Bill again, and then Bill for me, and so on. If we go in right now and work together, we can crowd the rest out, and there won't be anybody else get to dance with her the whole day. Come on, quick!" United in purpose, the 3 ran lightly to the dancing lawn, and Mr. Bullitt was successful, after a little debate, in obtaining the next dance with the lovely guest of the day.
"I did promise Big Uncle Georgiecums," she said, looking about her.
"Well, I don't think he'll come," said Joe. "That is, I'm pretty sure he won't." A shade fell upon the exquisite face.
"Naughty, Brother Josie Joe. The men always turn when Lola promised dances. Mustn't be rude."
"Well," Joe began, when he was interrupted by the Swedish lady named Anna, who spoke to them from the steps of the house. Of the merrymakers, they were the nearest.
"Dot pick fella," said Anna. "Dot one dot eats. We make him in a bedroom. He holler. He tank he need some help."
"Does he want a doctor?" Joe asked.
"Doctor? No. He want make him in an ambulance for hospital."
"I'll go look at him," Johnny Watson volunteered, running up. "He's my cousin, and I guess I got to take the responsibility." Miss Pratt paid the invalid the tribute of one faintly commiserating glance toward the house.
"Well," she said, "if people would rather eat too much than dance."
She meant dance with me, though she thought it prettier not to say so.
"Come on, Brother Josie Joe," she cried joyously.
And a little later, Johnny Watson approached her where she stood with a restored and refulgent William, about to begin the succeeding dance. Johnny dropped into her hand a ring, receiving one in return. "Thought I better get it," he said, offering no further explanation. "I'll take care of his until we get home." "He's all right," said Johnny, and then, perceiving a sudden advent of apprehension upon the sensitive brow of William, he went on reassuringly. "He's doing as well as anybody could expect, that is, after the crazy way he did. He's always been considered the dumbest one in all our relations. Never did know how to act. I don't mean he's exactly not got his senses, or ought to be watched, anything like that, and of course he belongs to an awful good family, but he's just kind of the black sheep when it comes to intelligence, or anything like that. I got him as comfortable as a person could be, and they're giving him hot water and mustard and stuff, but what he needs now is just to be kind of quiet. It'll do him a lot of good," Johnny concluded with a spark in his voice, "to lay there the rest of the afternoon and get quieted down, kind of." "You don't think there's any," William began, and after a pause continued, "any hope of his getting strong enough to come out and dance after a while?" Johnny shook his head. "None in the world," he said conclusively. "The best we can do for him is to let him entirely alone till after supper, and then ask nobody to sit on the back seat of the trolley car going home so we can make him comfortable back there and let him kind of stretch out by himself. Then gaily tinkled harp, gaily sang flute and violin. Over the greensward William lightly bore his lady, while radiant was the cleared sky above the happy dancers. William's fingers touched those delicate fingers. The exquisite face smiled rosily up to him. Undreamable sweetness beat rhythmically upon his glowing ears. His feet moved in a rhapsody of companionship with hers. They danced and danced and danced. Then Joe danced with her, while William and Johnny stood with hands upon each other's shoulders and watched, mayhap with longing, but without spite. Then Johnny danced with her, while Joe and William watched, and then William danced with her again. So passed the long, ineffable afternoon away. 17. "Did you have a good time at the trolley party?" the clerk in the corner drug store inquired that evening. "Fine," said William, taking his overcoat from the hook where he had left it. "How'd you like them little sweethearts I sold you?" "Fine," said William. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of 17. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jonathan Burchard, August 2009. 17 by Booth Tarkington, Chapter 22, Foreshadowings. Now the last rose had blown. The dandelion globes were long since on the wind. Gladioli and golden glow and salvia were here. The season moved toward asters and the goldenrod. This haloed summer still idled on its way, yet all the while sped quickly, like some languid lady in an elevator. There came a Sunday, very hot. Mr. and Mrs. Baxter, having walked a scorched half-mile from church, drooped thankfully into wicker chairs on their front porch, though Jane, who had accompanied them, immediately darted away, swinging her hat by its ribbon and skipping as lithesomely as if she had just come forth upon a cool morning. "I don't know how she does it," her father moaned, glancing after her and drying his forehead temporarily upon a handkerchief. "That would merely kill me dead, after walking in this heat." Then, for a time, the two were content to sit in silence, nodding to occasional acquaintances who passed in the desultory after-church procession. Mr. Baxter fanned himself with sporadic little bursts of energy which made his straw hat creak, and Mrs. Baxter sighed with the heat and gently rocked her chair. But as a group of 5 young people passed along the other side of the street, Mr. Baxter abruptly stopped fanning himself, and following the direction of his gaze, Mrs. Baxter ceased to rock. In half-completed attitudes they leaned slightly forward, sharing one of those pauses of parents who unexpectedly behold their offspring. "My soul," said William's father, "hasn't that girl gone home yet?" "He looks pale to me," Mrs. Baxter murmured absently. "I don't think he seems at all well lately." During 17 years, Mr. Baxter had gradually learned not to protest anxieties of this kind, unless he desired to argue with no prospect of ever getting a decision. "Hasn't she got any home?" he demanded testily. "Isn't she ever going to quit visiting the Parchers and let people have a little peace?" Mrs. Baxter disregarded this outburst as he had disregarded her remark about William's pallor. "You mean Miss Pratt?" she inquired dreamily, her eyes following the progress of her son. "No, he really doesn't look well at all." "Is she going to visit the Parchers all summer?" Mr. Baxter insisted. "She already has, about," said Mrs. Baxter. "Look at that boy," the father grumbled, "mooning along with all those other mooncalves. Can't even let her go to church alone. I wonder how many weeks of time, counting it out in hours, he's wasted that way this summer." "Oh, I don't know. You see, he never goes there in the evening." "Well, what of that? He's there all day, isn't he? What do they find to talk about? That's the mystery to me. Day after day, hours and hours. My soul, what do they say?" Mrs. Baxter laughed indulgently. "People are always wondering that about the other ages. Poor Willie. I think that a great deal of the time their conversation would be probably about as inconsequent as it is now. You see, Willie and Joe Bullitt are walking one on each side of Miss Pratt, and Johnny Watson has to walk behind with May Parcher. Joe and Johnny are there about as much as Willie is, and of course it's often his turn to be nice to May Parcher. He hasn't many chances to be tete-a-tete with Miss Pratt." Well, she ought to go home. I want that boy to get back into his senses. He's in an awful state." "I think she is going soon," said Mrs. Baxter. "The Parchers are to have a dance for her Friday night, and I understand there's to be a floor laid in the yard, and great things. It's a farewell party." "That's one mercy, anyhow." "And if you wonder what they say," she resumed, "why, probably they're all talking about the party. And when Willie is alone with her, well, what does anybody say?" Mrs. Baxter interrupted herself to laugh. "Jane, for instance. She's always fascinated by that darky Genesis when he's at work here in the yard, and they have long, long talks. I've seen them from the window. What on earth do you suppose they talk about? That's where Jane is now. She knew I'd told Genesis I'd give him something if he'd come and freeze the ice cream for us today, and when we got here, she heard the freezer and hopped right around there. If you went out to the back porch, you'd find them talking steadily, but what on earth about, I couldn't guess to save my life." And yet nothing could have been simpler, as a matter of fact. Jane and Genesis, attended by Clematis, were talking about society. That is to say, their discourse was not sociologic. Rather, it was of the frivolous and elegant. Watteau prevailed with them over John Stuart Mill. In a word, they spoke of the beau monde. Genesis turned the handle of the freezer with his left hand, allowing his right the freedom of gesture which was an intermittent necessity when he talked. In the matter of dress, Genesis had always been among the most informal of his race, but today there was a change almost unnerving to the Caucasian eye. He wore a balloonish suit of purple, strangely scalloped at pocket and cuff, and more strangely decorated with lines of small parasite buttons, in color blue, obviously buttons of leisure. His bulbous new shoes flashed back yellow fire at the embarrassed sun, and his collar, for he had gone so far, sent forth other sparkles, playing upon a polished surface over an inner graining of soot. Beneath it hung a simple, white, soiled evening tie, draped in a manner unintended by its manufacturer, and heavily overburdened by a green glass medallion of the Emperor Tiberius, set in brass. "Yes'm," said Genesis. "And now I'm in at swim. Flyin' round every night with all them blue vein people, I say, must go buy me some blue vein clothes. If I'm goin' to start, might as well start high. So first, I buy me this here gold necktie pin with this here lady's face carved out of green diamond, sittin' in the middle of all that gold. Then I buy me pair Royal King shoes. I got a friend of mine, this here Bluey Blowers. He say Royal King shoes, same kind of shoes he wear, and I walk straight in that store where they keep 'em at. Don't waste my time showin' me no old-time shoes, I say. Run out some of them big yellow lump-toed Royal Kings before my eyes, and first pair fit me I pay price, and wear 'em right off on me. Now I got me this here suit of clothes. Sign on 'em in a window. If you wish to be best dressed man in town, take me home for $6.97. That's kind of suit Genesis need, I say. If Genesis goin' to start dressin' high, might as well start top." Jane nodded gravely, comprehending the reasonableness of this view. "What made you decide to start, Genesis?" she asked earnestly. "I mean, how did it happen you began to get this way?" "Well, sir, 'tall come 'bout right like kind of slidin' into it 'stid of hoppin' and jumpin'. I spendin' the evenin' at lady's house, Fanny what cooked next door last year. Well, sir, 'at Lady Fanny, she quit private cookin'. She cateless." "She's what?" Jane asked. "What's that mean, Genesis? Cateless?" "She caters," he explained. "If it's a man, you call him a cater. If it's a lady, she's a cateless. She does catin' for all them blue vein families in town. She make refreshments, bring waiters, 'at's catin'. You ma give big dinner, she have Fanny cater, and don't take no trouble 'tall herself. Fanny take all that trouble." "I see," said Jane. "But I don't see how her being a cateless started you to dressin' so high, Genesis." "This here way. Fanny say, 'Look here, Genesis, I got big job tomorrow night, and I'm man short. Kinda havin' to have a 'nouncer." "A what?" Fanny talk just that way. Goin' to be a big dinner party. And this here blue vein family tell Fanny they want whole lot extra sploogin'. Tell her put fine-lookin' colored man stand by drawin' room door. You ask everybody name and holler out whatever name they say, just as they walk in. This year family say they go and show what's what in this town, and they bound family go get 'em a 'nouncer. Well, what's matter you doin' at 'nouncin'? Fanny say. "Who, me?" I tell her. "Yes, you kin, too." she said, and she say she lend me that waiter suit used to belong old Henry Gimlet, what died when he owin' Fanny $16, and Fanny tuck and keep that waiter suit. She use that suit on extra waiters when she got some on her hands what ain't got no waiter suit. You wear that suit, Fanny say, and you be good announcer, 'cause you a fine big man and got big grand voice. And then you learn before long to be a waiter, Genesis, and get $1.50 every evening you waitin', sides all that money you make cuttin' grass daytime. Well, sir, I standin' up doin' that announcin' very next night. White lady and gentleman walk towards my door. I stepped up to 'em this-a-way. Here, Genesis found it pleasant to present the scene with some elaboration. He dropped the handle of the freezer, rose, assumed a stately but ingratiating expression, and stepped up to the imagined couple, using a pacing and rhythmic gait, a conservative prance, which plainly indicated the simultaneous operation of an orchestra. Then, bending graciously, as though the persons addressed were of dwarfish stature, "Excuse me," he said, "but can I please be so polite as to quire your name?" For a moment he listened attentively, then nodded, and returning with the same aristocratic undulations to an imaginary doorway near the freezer, "Mr. and Mrs. Orlosco Rinktum," he proclaimed, sonorously. "Who?" cried Jane, fascinated. "Genesis, announce that again, right away." Genesis heartily complied. "Mr. and Mrs. Orlosco Rinktum," he bawled. "Was that really their names?" she asked eagerly. "Well, I kind of forget," Genesis admitted, resuming his work with the freezer. "Seems like I recollect somebody got named good deal like what I say, 'cause some mighty blue-vein names at that dinner party, yes, sir. But I only get to be 'nouncer one time, 'cause Fanny tellin' me next family have dinner party make heap of fun. Say, I done my 'nouncin' good, but say, what's the use hollerin' names just for some of the neighbors or their own aunts and uncles to walk in, when everybody already knows 'em? So Fanny promote me to waiter, and I round right in amongst big doin's most every night. Pass ice cream, lemonade, lemon ice, cake, sandwiches. Let me hand you a little more chicken salad, ma'am. Let me be so kind as to get you fresh cup of coffee, sir. Sway old Genesis talkin' every even these days." Jane looked at him thoughtfully. "Do you like it better than cuttin' grass, Genesis?" she asked. He paused to consider. "Yes'm. When band play all them tunes, my goodness, do sound grand." "You can't do it tonight, though, Genesis," said Jane. "You have to be quiet on Sunday nights, don't you?" "Yes'm. Ain't got no more catin' till next Friday even." "Oh, I bet that's the party for Miss Pratt at Mr. Parcher's," Jane cried. "Didn't I guess right?" "Yes'm, I reckon I'm a-goin' see one you family at night, see him dancin', wait on him at refreshments." Jane's expression became even more serious than usual. "Willie? I don't know whether he's goin', Genesis." "Land name!" Genesis exclaimed. "He'd die if he don't get invited to 'at ball." "Oh, he's invited," said Jane. "Only I think maybe he won't go." "My goodness, why ain't he goin'?" Jane looked at her friend studiously before replying. "Well, it's a secret," she said finally, "but it's a very interesting one, and I'll tell you if you never tell." "Yes'm, I ain't tellin' nobody." Jane glanced around, then stepped a little closer and told the secret with the solemnity it deserved. "Well, when Miss Pratt first came to visit Miss May Parcher, Willie used to keep Papa's evening clothes in his window seat, and Mama wondered what had become of them. Then, after dinner, he'd slip up there and put 'em on him, and go out through the kitchen and call on Miss Pratt. Then Mama found 'em, and she thought he oughtn't to do that, so she didn't tell him or anything, and she didn't even tell Papa, but she had the tailor make 'em ever and ever so much bigger, 'cause they were gettin' too tight for Papa. And well, so after that, even if Willie could get 'em out of Mama's clothes closet where she keeps 'em now, he'd look so funny in 'em he couldn't wear 'em. Well, and then he couldn't go to pay calls on Miss Pratt in the evening since then, because Mama says after he started to go there in that suit, he couldn't go without it. Or maybe Miss Pratt, or the other ones that's in love of her, would think it was pretty queer, and maybe kind of expect that it was Papa's all the time. Mama says she thinks Willie must have worried a good deal over reasons to say why he'd always go in the daytime after that, and never came in the evening. And now they're going to have this party, and she says he's been getting paler and paler every day since he heard about it. Mama says he's pale some because Miss Pratt's going away, but she thinks it's a good deal more because, well, if he would wear those evening clothes just to go callin', how would it be to go to that party and not have any? That's what Mama thinks, and, Genesis, you promised you'd never tell as long as you live. Yes'm, I ain't tellin', Genesis chuckled. I'm a-goin' to get me one of them waiter suits before long myself, so's I can quit wearing that old Henry gimlet suit what belonged to Fanny, and have me a private suit of my own. They's a second-hand store over on the avenue, where they got swallow-tail suits all way from $7 to $19.98. Jane started, interrupting him. Shh, she whispered, laying a finger warningly upon her lips. William had entered the yard at the back gate, and approaching over the lawn, had arrived at the steps of the porch before Jane perceived him. She gave him an apprehensive look, but he passed into the house absent-mindedly, not even flinching at sight of Clematis. And Mrs. Baxter was right. William did look pale. "I guess he didn't hear us," said Jane, when he had disappeared into the interior. "He acts awful funny," she added, thoughtfully. "First, when he was in love of Miss Pratt, he'd be mad about something almost every minute he was home. Couldn't anybody say anything to him, but he'd just behave as if it was frightful. And then if you'd see him out walking with Miss Pratt, well, he'd look like... Jane paused. Her eye fell upon Clematis, and by a happy inspiration she was able to complete her simile with remarkable accuracy. He'd look like the way Clematis looks at people. That's just exactly the way he'd look, Genesis, when he was walking with Miss Pratt. And then, when he was home, he got so quiet he couldn't answer questions and wouldn't hear what anybody said to him at table or anywhere. And Papa'd nearly almost bust. Mama and Papa'd talk and talk about it, and," she lowered her voice, "and I knew what they were talking about. Well, and then he'd hardly ever get mad any more. He'd just sit in his room, and sometimes he'd sit in there without any light, or he'd sit out in the yard all by himself all evening, maybe, and the other evening, after I was in bed, I heard him, and Papa said, well, this is what Papa told Mama." And again, lowering her voice, she proffered the quotation from her father in a tone somewhat awestruck. "Papa said, by gosh, if he ever thought a son of his could make such a word idiot of himself, he almost wished we'd both been girls." Having completed this report in a violent whisper, Jane nodded repeatedly for emphasis, and Genesis shook his head to show that he was as deeply impressed as she wished him to be. "I guess," she added, after a pause, "I guess Willie didn't hear anything you and I talked about him, or clothes, or anything." She was mistaken in part. William had caught no reference to himself, but he had overheard something, and he was now alone in his room, thinking about it almost feverishly. A second-hand store over on the avenue where they got swaller-tail suits all way from $7 to $19.98. Civilization is responsible for certain longings in the breast of man, artificial longings, but sometimes as poignant as hunger and thirst. Of these, the strongest are those of the maid for the bridal veil, of the lad for long trousers, and of the youth for a tailed coat of state. To the gratification of this last, only a few of the early joys in life are comparable. Indulged youth, too rich, can know, to the unctuous full, neither the longing nor the gratification, but one such as William, in moderate circumstances, is privileged to pant for his first evening clothes as the hart panteth after the water brook, and sometimes to pant in vain. Also, this was a crisis in William's life. In addition to his yearning for such apparel, he was racked by a passionate urgency. As Jane had so precociously understood, unless he should somehow manage to obtain the proper draperies, he could not go to the farewell dance for Miss Pratt. Other unequipped boys could go in their ordinary best clothes, but William could not, for, alack, he had dressed too well too soon. He was in desperate case. The sorrow of the approaching great departure was but the heavier because it had been so long deferred. To William it had seemed that this flower-strewn summer could actually end no more than he could actually die. But time had begun its awful lecture, and even 17 was listening. Miss Pratt, that magic girl, was going home. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of 17. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jonathan Burchard, August 2009. 17 by Booth Tarkington, Chapter 23, Fathers Forget. To the competent 20s, hundreds of miles suggesting no impossibility, such departures may be rending, but not tragic. Implacable the difference to 17. Miss Pratt was going home, and 17 could not follow. It could only mourn upon the lonely shore, tracing little angelic footprints left in the sand. To 17, such a departure is final. It is a vanishing. And now it seemed possible that William might be deprived even of the last romantic consolations, of the last waltz together, of the last listening to music in the moonlight together, of all those sacred lasts of the last evening together. He had pleaded strongly for a dress suit as a fitting recognition of his 17th birthday anniversary, but he had been denied by his father with a jocularity more crushing than rigor. Since then, in particular since the arrival of Miss Pratt, Mr. Baxter's temper had been growing steadily more and more even. That is, as affected by William's social activities, it was uniformly bad. Nevertheless, after heavy brooding, William decided to make one final appeal before he resorted to measures which the necessities of despair had caused him to contemplate. He wished to give himself every chance for a good effect. Therefore he did not act hastily, but went over what he intended to say, rehearsing it with a few appropriate gestures, and even taking some pleasure in the pathetic dignity of this performance, as revealed by occasional glances at the mirror of his dressing-table. In spite of these little alleviations, his trouble was great and all too real, for unhappily the previous rehearsal of an emotional scene does not prove the emotion insincere. Descending, he found his father and mother still sitting upon the front porch. Then, standing before them, solemn-eyed, he uttered a preluding cough and began. "Father," he said in a loud voice, "I have come to—" "Dear me!" Mrs. Baxter exclaimed, not perceiving that she was interrupting an intended oration. "Willie, you do look pale. Sit down, poor child. You oughtn't to walk so much in this heat." "Father," William repeated, "Father—" "I suppose you got her safely home from church," Mr. Baxter said. "She might have been carried off by footpads if you three boys hadn't been along to take care of her." But William persisted heroically. "Father," he said, "Father, I have come to—" "What on earth's the matter with you?" Mr. Baxter ceased to fan himself. Mrs. Baxter stopped rocking, and both stared, for it had dawned upon them that something unusual was beginning to take place. William backed to the start and tried it again. "Father, I have come to—" He paused and gulped, evidently expecting to be interrupted, but both of his parents remained silent, regarding him with puzzled surprise. "Father," he began once more, I have come to place before you something I think it's your duty as my father to undertake, and I have thought over this step before laying it before you." "My soul," said Mr. Baxter under his breath. "My soul." "At my age," William continued, swallowing, and fixing his earnest eyes upon the roof of the porch, to avoid the disconcerting stare of his father, "at my age, there's some things that ought to be done and some things that ought not to be done. If you ask me what I thought ought to be done, there is only one answer. When anybody as old as I am has to go out among other young men his own age that already got one, like anyway half of them have, who I go with, and their fathers have already taken such a step, because they felt it was the only right thing to do, because at my age, and the young men I go with's age, it is the only right thing to do, because that is something nobody could deny, at my age." Here William drew a long breath, and, deciding to abandon that sentence as irrevocably tangled, began another. "I have thought over this step, because there comes a time to every young man when they must lay a step before their father before something happens that they would be sorry for. I have thought this undertaking over, and I am certain it would be your honest duty—" "My soul!" gasped Mr. Baxter. "I thought I knew you pretty well, but you talk like a stranger to me. What is all this? What you want?" "A dress suit," said William. He had intended to say a great deal more before coming to the point, but although through nervousness he had lost some threads of his rehearsed plea, it seemed to him that he was getting along well and putting his case with some distinction and power. He was surprised and hurt, therefore, to hear his father utter a wordless shout in a tone of wondering derision. "I have more to say," William began, but Mr. Baxter cut him off. "A dress suit!" he cried. "Well, I'm glad you were talking about something, because I honestly thought it must be too much sun." At this, the troubled William brought his eyes down from the porch roof and forgot his rehearsal. He lifted his hand appealingly. "Father," he said, "I got to have one." "Got to?" Mr. Baxter laughed a laugh that chilled the supplicant through and through. "At your age, I thought I was lucky if I had any suit that was fit to be seen in. You're too young, Willie. I don't want you to get your mind on such stuff, and if I have my way, you won't have a dress suit for 4 years more, anyhow." "Father, I got to have one. I got to have one right away." The urgency in William's voice was almost tearful. "I don't ask you to have it made or to go to expensive tailors, but there's plenty of good ready-made ones that only cost about $40. They're advertised in the paper. Father, wouldn't you spend just $40? I'll pay it back when I'm in business. I'll work." Mr. Baxter waved all this aside. "It's not the money. It's the principle that I'm standing for, and I don't intend—" "Father, won't you do it?" "No, I will not." William saw that sentence had been passed, and all appeals for a new trial denied. He choked, and rushed into the house without more ado. "Poor boy," his mother said. "Poor boy, nothing!" fumed Mr. Baxter. "He's about lost his mind over that Miss Pratt. Think of his coming out here and starting a regular debating society declamation before his mother and father. Why, I never heard anything like it in my life. I don't like to hurt his feelings, and I'd give him anything I could afford that would do him any good, but all he wants it for now is to splurge around in at this party before that little yellow-haired girl. I guess he can wear the kind of clothes most of the other boys wear, the kind I wore at parties, and never thought about wearing anything else. What's the world getting to be like? 17 years old and throws a fit because he can't have a dress suit." Mrs. Baxter looked thoughtful. But suppose he felt he couldn't go to the dance unless he wore one, poor boy." "All the better," said Mr. Baxter firmly. "Do him good to keep away and get his mind on something else." "Of course," she suggested with some timidity, $40 isn't a great deal of money. And a ready-made suit, just to begin with." Naturally, Mr. Baxter perceived whither she was drifting. $40 isn't $1,000, he interrupted. "But what you want to throw it away for? One reason a boy of 17 oughtn't to have evening clothes is the way he behaves with any clothes. $40? Why, only this summer he sat down on Jane's open paint box twice in 1 week." "Well, Miss Pratt is going away, and the dance will be her last night. I'm afraid it would really hurt him to miss it. I remember once, before we were engaged, that evening before Papa took me abroad, and you—" "It's no use, Mama," he said. "We were both in the 20s. Why, I was 6 years older than Willie even then. There's no comparison at all. I'll let him order a dress suit on his 21st birthday and not a minute before. I don't believe in it, and I intend to see that he gets all this stuff out of his system. He's got to learn some hard sense." Mrs. Baxter shook her head doubtfully, but she said no more. Perhaps she regretted a little that she had caused Mr. Baxter's evening clothes to be so expansively enlarged, for she looked rather regretful. She also looked rather incomprehensible, not to say cryptic, during the long silence which followed, and Mr. Baxter resumed his rocking, unaware of the fixity of gaze which his wife maintained upon him, a thing the most loyal will do sometimes. The incomprehensible look disappeared before long, but the regretful one was renewed in the mother's eyes whenever she caught glimpses of her son that day, and at the table, where William's manner was gentle, even toward his heartless father. Underneath that gentleness, the harried self of William was no longer debating a desperate resolve, but had fixed upon it, and on the following afternoon Jane chanced to be a witness of some resultant actions. She came to her mother with an account of them. "Mamma, what you s'pose Willie wants of those 2 old market baskets that were down cellar?" "Why, Jane?" "Well, he carried 'em in his room, and then he saw me lookin', and he said, 'G'way from here,' and shut the door. He looked so funny. What's he want of those old baskets, Mamma?" "I don't know. Perhaps he doesn't even know himself, Jane." But William did know, definitely. He had set the baskets upon chairs, and now, with pale determination, he was proceeding to fill them. When his task was completed, the 2 baskets contained 1. Heavyweight winter suit of clothes, 1. Lightweight summer suit of clothes, 1 cap, 1 straw hat, 2 pairs of white flannel trousers, 2 madras shirts, 2 flannel shirts, 2 silk shirts, 7 soft collars, 3 silk neckties, 1 crocheted tie, 8 pairs of socks, 1 pair of patent leather shoes, 1 pair of tennis shoes, 1 overcoat, some underwear, 1 2-foot shelf of books consisting of several sterling works upon mathematics in a damaged condition, 5 of Shakespeare's plays, expurgated for schools and colleges, and also damaged, a work upon political economy, and another upon the science of physics, Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, How to Enter a Drawing Room, and 500 other hints, with witty sayings from here and there, Lorna Doone, Quentin Durward, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, a very old copy of Moths, and a small Bible. William spread handkerchiefs upon the 2 over-bulging cargoes, that their nature might not be disclosed to the curious, and after listening a moment at his door, took the baskets, 1 upon each arm, then went quickly down the stairs and out of the house, out of the yard and into the alley, by which route he had modestly chosen to travel. After an absence of about 2 hours, he returned empty-handed and anxious. "Mother, I want to speak to you," he said, addressing Mrs. Baxter in a voice which clearly proved the strain of these racking days. "I want to speak to you about something important." "Yes, Willie?" "Please send Jane away. I can't talk about important things with a child in the room." Jane, naturally, wished to stay, since he was going to say something important. "Mamma, do I have to go?" "Just a few minutes, dear." Jane walked submissively out of the door, leaving it open behind her. Then, having gone about 6 feet farther, she halted, and, preserving a breathless silence, consoled herself for her banishments by listening to what was said, hearing it all as satisfactorily as she had remained in the room. Quiet, thoughtful children like Jane avail themselves of these little pleasures oftener than is suspected. "Mother," said William with great intensity, "I want to ask you please to lend me $3.60. "What for, Willie?" "Mother, I just ask you to lend me $3.60. "But what for?" "Mother, I don't feel I can discuss it any. I simply ask you, will you lend me $3.60? Mrs. Baxter laughed gently. "I don't think I could, Willie, but certainly I should want to know what for. Mother, I am going on 18 years of age, and when I ask for a small sum of money like $3.60, I think I might be trusted to know how to use it for my own good without having to answer questions like a "Why, Willie!" she exclaimed. "You ought to have plenty of money of your own." "Of course I ought," he agreed warmly, "if you'd ask father to give me a regular No, I mean you ought to have plenty left out of that old junk and furniture I let you sell last month. You had over $9. "Well, that was 5 weeks ago," William explained wearily. "But you certainly must have some of it left. Why, it was more than $9, I believe. I think it was nearer 10. Surely you haven't—" "Ye gods!" cried the goaded William. "A person going on 18 years old ought to be able to spend $9 in 5 weeks without everybody's acting like it was a crime. Mother, I ask you the simple question, will you please lend me $3.60? "I don't think I ought to, dear. I'm sure your father wouldn't wish me to, unless you'll tell me what you want it for. In fact, I won't consider it at all unless you do tell me." "You won't do it?" he quavered. She shook her head gently. "You see, dear, I'm afraid the reason you don't tell me is because you know that I wouldn't give it to you if I knew what you wanted it for." This perfect diagnosis of the case so disheartened him that after a few monosyllabic efforts to continue the conversation with dignity he gave it up, and left in such a preoccupation with despondency that he passed the surprised Jane in the hall without suspecting what she had been doing. That evening, after dinner, he addressed to his father an impassioned appeal for $3.60, laying such stress of pathos on this principal argument that if he couldn't have a dress suit, at least he ought to be given $3.60, the emphasis is William's, that Mr. Baxter was moved in the direction of consent. But not far enough. "I'd like to let you have it, Willie," he said, excusing himself for refusal, "but your mother felt she oughtn't to do it unless you'd say what you wanted it for, and I'm sure she wouldn't like me to do it. I can't let you have it unless you get her to say she wants me to." Thus advised, the unfortunate made another appeal to his mother the next day, and having brought about no relaxation of the situation, again petitioned his father on the following evening. So it went, the torn and driven William turning from parent to parent, and surely, since the world began, the special sum of $3.60 has never been so often mentioned in any one house and in the same space of time as it was in the house of the Baxters during Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday of that oppressive week. But on Friday, William disappeared after breakfast and did not return to lunch. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of 17. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jonathan Burchard, August 2009. 17 by Booth Tarkington. Chapter 24. Clothes Make the Man. Mrs. Baxter was troubled. During the afternoon she glanced often from the open window of the room where she had gone to sew, but the peaceful neighborhood continued to be peaceful, and no sound of the harassed footsteps of William echoed from the pavement. However, she saw Genesis arrive, in his weekday costume, to do some weeding, and Jane immediately skipped forth for mingled purposes of observation and conversation. "What do they say?" thought Mrs. Baxter, observing that both Jane and Genesis were unusually animated. But for once that perplexity was to be dispersed. After an exciting half-hour, Jane came flying to her mother, breathless. "Mama!" she cried. "I know where Willie is! Genesis told me, 'cause he saw him, and he talked to him while he was doing it." "Doing what? Where?" "Mama, listen. What you think Willie's doing? I bet you can't get—" "Jane!" Mrs. Baxter spoke sharply. "Tell me what Genesis said at once." "Yes'm. Willie's sittin' in a lumber yard that Genesis comes by on his way from over on the avenue where all the colored people live, and he's countin' knotholes in shingles." "He is what?" "Yes'm. Genesis knows all about it, because he was thinkin' of doin' it himself, only he says it would be too slow. This is the way it is, Mama. Listen, Mama, because this is just exactly the way it is. Well, this lumberyard man got into some sort of a fuss because he bought millions and millions of shingles, Mama, that had too many knots in, and the man don't want to pay for 'em, or else the store where he bought 'em won't take 'em back, and they got to prove how many shingles are bad shingles or somepin'. And anyway, Mama, that's what Willie's doin'. Every time he comes to a bad shingle, Mama, he puts it somewheres else, or somepin' like that, Mama, and every time he's put 1,000 bad shingles in this other place they give him 6 cents. He gets the 6 cents to keep, Mama, and that's what he's been doin' all day." "Good gracious!" "Oh, but that's nothing, Mama. Just wait till you hear the rest. That part of it isn't anything at all, Mama. You wouldn't hardly notice that part of it if you knew the other part of it, Mama. Why, that isn't anything!" Jane made demonstrations of scorn for the insignificant information already imparted. "Jane?" "Yes'm." "I want to know everything Genesis told you," said her mother, "and I want you to tell it as quickly as you can." "Well, I am tellin' it, Mama," Jane protested. "I'm just beginning to tell it. I can't tell it unless there's a beginning, can I? How could there be anything unless you had to begin it, Mama?" "Try your best to go on, Jane." "Yes'm. Well, Genesis says—" "Mama!" Jane interrupted herself with a little outcry. "Oh, I bet that's what he had those 2 market baskets for. Yes, sir, that's just what he did. And then he needed the rest of the money, and you and Papa wouldn't give him any. So he began counting shingles today, 'cause tonight's the night of the party, and he just has to have it." Mrs. Baxter, who had risen to her feet, recalled the episode of the baskets and sank into a chair. "How did Genesis know Willie wanted $40? And if Willie's pawned something, how did Genesis know that? Did Willie tell Oh, no, Mama. Willie didn't want $40, only 14. But he couldn't get even the cheapest ready-made dress suit for $14. "Mama, you're getting it all mixed up," Jane cried. "Listen, Mama. Genesis knows all about a second-hand store over on the avenue, and it keeps most everything. And Genesis says it's the nicest store. It keeps waiter suits all the way up to $19.99. Well, and Genesis wants to get one of those suits, so he goes in there all the time and talks to the man and bargains with him. 'Cause Genesis says this man is the bargainest man in the wide world, Mama. That's what Genesis says. Well, and so this man's name is One-Eye Belgius, Mama. That's his name, and Genesis says so. Well, and so this man that Genesis told me about that keeps the store, One-Eye Belgius, Mama, well, One-Eye Belgius had Willie's name written down in a book, and he knew Genesis worked for families that have boys like Willie in 'em. And this morning, One-Eye Belgius shows Genesis Willie's name written down in this book. And One-Eye Belgius asked Genesis if he knew anybody by that name and all about him. Well, and so at first, Genesis pretended he was trying to remember because he wanted to find out what Willie went there for. Genesis didn't tell any stories, Mama. He just pretended he couldn't remember. And so, One-Eye Belgius kept talking, and pretty soon Genesis found out all about it. One-Eye Belgius said Willie came in there and tried on the coat of one of those waiter suits. "Oh, no!" gasped Mrs. Baxter. "Yes'm, and One-Eye Belgius said it was the only one that would fit Willie, and One-Eye Belgius told Willie that suit was worth $14, and Willie said he didn't have any money, but he'd like to trade something else for it. Well, and so One-Eye Belgius said this was an awful fine suit, and the only one that he had that had belonged to a white gentleman. Well, and so they bargained and bargained and bargained and bargained. And then, well, and so at last Willie said he'd go and get everything that belonged to him, and One-Eye Belgius could pick out enough to make $14 worth, and then Willie could have the suit. Well, and so Willie came home and put everything he had that belonged to him in those 2 baskets, Mama. That's just what he did, 'cause Genesis says he told One-Eye Belgius it was everything that belonged to him, and that would take 2 baskets, Mama. Well then, and so he told One-Eye Belgius to pick out $14 worth, and One-Eye Belgius asked Willie if he didn't have a watch. Well, Willie took out his watch, and One-Eye Belgius says it was an awful bad watch, but he would put it in for $1. And he said, "I'll put your necktie pin in for 40 cents more." So Willie took it out of his necktie, and then One-Eye Belgius said it would take all the things in the baskets to make I forget how much, Mama, and the watch would be $1 more, and the pin 40 cents, and that would leave just $3.60 more for Willie to pay before he could get the suit. Mrs. Baxter's face had become suffused with high color, but she wished to know all that Genesis had said, and mastering her feelings with an effort, she told Jane to proceed, a command obeyed after Jane had taken several long breaths. "Well, and so the worst part of it is, Genesis says, it's because that suit is haunted." "What?" "Yes'm," said Jane solemnly. "Genesis says it's haunted. Genesis says everybody over on the avenue knows all about that suit, and he says that's why One-Eye Belgius could never sell it before. Genesis says One-Eye Belgius tried to sell it to a colored man for $3, but the man said he wouldn't put it on for $300, and Genesis said he wouldn't either, because it belonged to a dago waiter that Jane's voice sank to a whisper of unctuous horror. She was having a wonderful time. "Mama, this dago waiter, he lived over on the avenue, and he took a case knife he'd sharpened, and he cut a lady's head off with it." Mrs. Baxter screamed faintly. "And he got hung, Mama. If you don't believe it, you can ask One-Eye Belgius. I guess he knows. And you can ask—" "Hush! And he sold this suit to One-Eye Belgius when he was in jail, Mama. He sold it to him before he got hung, Mama. Hush, Jane!" But Jane couldn't hush now. "And he had that suit on when he cut the lady's head off, Mama, and that's why it's haunted. They cleaned it all up except a few little spots of blood—" "Jane!" shouted her mother. "You must not talk about such things, and Genesis mustn't tell you stories of that sort." "Well, how could he help it, if he told me about Willie?" Jane urged reasonably. "Never mind. Did that crazy Did Willie leave the baskets in that dreadful place?" "Yes'm, and his watch and pin," Jane informed her impressively. And One-Eye Belgius wanted to know if Genesis knew Willie, because One-Eye Belgius wanted to know if Genesis thought Willie could get the $3.60, and One-Eye Belgius wanted to know if Genesis thought he could get anything more out of him besides that. He told Genesis he hadn't told Willie he could have the suit, after all. He just told him he thought he could, but he wouldn't say for certain till he brought him the $3.60. So Willie left all his things there, and his watch, and—" "That will do!" Mrs. Baxter's voice was sharper than it had ever been in Jane's recollection. "I don't need to hear any more, and I don't want to hear any more." Jane was justly aggrieved. "But, Mama, it isn't my fault." Mrs. Baxter's lips parted to speak, but she checked herself. "Fault?" she said gravely. "I wonder whose fault it really is." With that, she went hurriedly into William's room and made a brief inspection of his clothes closet and dressing table. Then, as Jane watched her in awed silence, she strode to the window and called loudly, "Genesis!" "Yes'm," came the voice from below. "Go to that lumber yard where Mr. William is at work and bring him here to me at once. If he declines to come, tell him—" Her voice broke oddly. She choked, but Jane could not decide with what emotion. "Tell him I ordered you to use force if necessary. Hurry." "Yes'm." Jane ran to the window in time to see Genesis departing seriously through the back gate. "Mama—" "Don't talk to me now, Jane," Mrs. Baxter said crisply. "I want you to go down in the yard, and when Willie comes, tell him I'm waiting for him here in his own room. And don't come with him, Jane. Run." "Yes, Mama." Jane was pleased with this appointment. She anxiously desired to be the first to see how Willie looked. He looked flurried and flustered and breathless, and there were blisters upon the reddened palms of his hand. "What on earth's the matter, Mother?" he asked, as he stood panting before her. "Genesis said something was wrong, and he said you told him to hit me if I wouldn't come." "Oh, no," she cried. "I only meant I thought perhaps you wouldn't obey any ordinary message." Well, it doesn't matter, but please hurry and say what you want to, because I got to get back and—" "No," Mrs. Baxter said quietly. "You're not going back to count any more shingles, Willie. How much have you earned?" He swallowed, but spoke bravely. 36 cents. But I've been getting lots faster the last 2 hours, and there's a good deal of time before 6 o'clock, Mother." "No," she said. "You're going over to that horrible place where you've left your clothes and your watch and all those other things in the 2 baskets, and you're going to bring them home at once." "Mother!" he cried aghast. "Who told you?" "It doesn't matter. You don't want your father to find out, do you? Then get those things back here as quickly as you can. They'll have to be fumigated after being in that den." "They've never been out of the baskets," he protested hotly, "except just to be looked at. They're my things, Mother, and I had a right to do what I needed to with them, didn't I?" His utterance became difficult. "You and Father just can't understand, and you won't do anything to help me." "Willie, you can go to the party," she said gently. "You didn't need those frightful clothes at all." "I do," he cried. "I got to have 'em. I can't go in my day clothes. There's a reason you wouldn't understand why I can't. I just can't." "Yes," she said. "You can go to the party." "I can't either. Not unless you give me $3.24, or unless I can get back to the lumber yard and earn the rest before—" "No!" And the warm color that had rushed over Mrs. Baxter during Jane's sensational recital returned with a vengeance. Her eyes flashed. "If you'd rather I sent a policeman for those baskets, I'll send one. I should prefer to do it, much, and to have that rascal arrested. If you don't want me to send a policeman, you can go for them yourself. And you must start within 10 minutes, because if you don't, I'll telephone headquarters. 10 minutes, Willie, and I mean it." He cried out, protesting. She would make him a thing of scorn forever and soil his honor if she sent a policeman. Mr. Belgis was a fair and honest tradesman, he explained passionately, and had not made the approaches in this matter. Also, the garments in question, though not entirely new, nor of the highest mode, were of good material and in splendid condition. Unmistakably, they were evening clothes, and such a bargain at $14 that William would guarantee to sell them for $20 after he had worn them this one evening. Mr. Belgis himself had said that he would not even think of letting them go at $14 to anybody else, and as for the 2 poor baskets of worn and useless articles offered in exchange, and a bent scarf pin and a worn-out silver watch that had belonged to Great Uncle Ben, why, the $10.40 allowed upon them was beyond all ordinary liberality. It was almost charity. There was only one place in town where evening clothes were rented, and the suspicious persons in charge had insisted that William obtain from his father a guarantee to ensure the return of the garments in perfect condition. So that was hopeless. And wasn't it better, also, to wear clothes which had known only one previous occupant, as was the case with Mr. Belgis' offering, than to hire what chance hundreds had hired. Finally, there was only one thing to be considered, and this was the fact that William had to have those clothes. 6 minutes, said Mrs. Baxter, glancing implacably at her watch. When it's 10, I'll telephone. And the end of it was, of course, victory for the woman. Victory both moral and physical. 3/4 of an hour later, she was unburdening the contents of the 2 baskets and putting the things back in place, illuminating these actions with an expression of strong distaste, in spite of broken assurances that Mr. Belgis had not more than touched any of the articles offered to him for valuation. At dinner, which was unusually early that evening, Mrs. Baxter did not often glance toward her son. She kept her eyes from that white face, and spent most of her time in urging upon Mr. Baxter that he should be prompt in dressing for a card club meeting which he and she were to attend that evening. These admonitions of hers were continued so pressingly that Mr. Baxter, after protesting that there was no use in being a whole hour too early, groaningly went to dress without even reading his paper. William had retired to his own room, where he lay upon his bed in the darkness. He had heard the evening noises of the house faintly through the closed door, voices and the clatter of metal and china from the faraway kitchen, Jane's laugh in the hall, the opening and closing of the doors. Then his father seemed to be in distress about something. William heard him complaining to Mrs. Baxter, and though the words were indistinct, the tone was vigorously plaintive. Mrs. Baxter laughed and appeared to make light of his troubles, whatever they were, and presently their footsteps were audible from the stairway. The front door closed emphatically, and they were gone. Everything was quiet now. The open window showed as a greenish oblong set in black, and William knew that in a little while there would come through the stillness of that window the distant sound of violins. That was a moment he dreaded with a dread that ached, and as he lay upon his dreary bed, he thought of brightly lighted rooms where other boys were dressing eagerly, faces and hair shining, hearts beating high, boys who would possess this last evening and the last waltz together, the last smile and the last sigh. It did not once enter his mind that he could go to the dance in his best suit, or that possibly the other young people at the party would be too busy with their own affairs to notice particularly what he wore. It was the unquestionable and granite fact, to his mind, that the whole derisive world would know the truth about his earlier appearances in his father's clothes, and that was a form of ruin not to be faced. In the protective darkness and seclusion of William's bedroom, it is possible that smarting eyes relieve themselves by blinking rather energetically. It is even possible that there was a minute damp spot upon the pillow. 17 cannot always manage the little boy yet alive under all the coverings. Now arrived that moment he had most painfully anticipated, and dance music drifted on the night. But there came a tapping upon his door, and a soft voice spoke. "Willie." With a sharp exclamation, William swung his legs over the edge of the bed and sat up. Of all things he desired no conversation with or on the part of Jane. But he had forgotten to lock his door. The handle turned, and a dim little figure marched in. "Willie, Adelia's going to put me to bed." "You away from here," he said huskily. "I haven't got time to talk to you. I'm busy." "Well, you can wait a minute, can't you?" she asked reasonably. "I have to tell you a joke on Mama." "I don't want to hear any jokes." "Well, I have to tell you this one, 'cause she told me to." "Oh!" Jane clapped her hand over her mouth and jumped up and down, offering a fantastic silhouette against the light of the open door. "Oh, oh, oh! What's matter?" "She said I mustn't tell that she told me to tell." "My goodness, I forgot that. Mama took me off alone right after dinner, and she told me to tell you this joke on her a little after she and Papa had left the house. But she said, above all things, she said, 'Don't let Willie know I said to tell him.' That's just what she said, and here that's the very first thing I had to go and do." "Well, what of it?" Jane quieted down. The pangs of her remorse were lost in her love of sensationalism, and her voice sank to the thrilling whisper which it was one of her greatest pleasures to use. "Did you hear what a fuss Papa was making when he was dressing for the card party?" "I don't care if—" "He had to
go in his regular clothes," whispered Jane triumphantly. "And this is the joke on Mama. You know that tailor that let Papa's dress suit way out? Well, Mama thinks that tailor, they must think she's crazy or something, 'cause she took Papa's dress suit to him last Monday to get it pressed for this card party, and she guesses he must have understood her to tell him to do lots besides just pressing it. Anyway, he went and altered it, and he took it way in again, and this afternoon when it came back it was even tighter than it was in the first place, and Papa couldn't begin to get into it. Well, and so it's all pressed and everything." And she stopped on the way out and whispered to me that she'd got so upset over the joke on her that she couldn't remember where she put it when she took it out of Papa's room after he gave up trying to get inside of it. "And that," cried Jane, "was the funniest thing of all. Why, it's laying right on her bed this very moment." In one bound, William leaped through the open door. 2 seconds sufficed for his passage through the hall to his mother's bedroom. Chapter 25 of 17. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jonathan Burchard, August 2009. 17 by Booth Tarkington, Chapter 25, Youth, and Mr. Parcher. As a hurried worldling, in almost perfectly fitting evening clothes, passed out of his father's gateway and hurried toward the place whence faintly came the sound of dance music, a child's voice called sweetly from an unidentified window of the darkened house behind him. "Well, anyway, you try and have a good time, Willie." William made no reply. He paused not in his stride. Jane's farewell injunction, though obviously not ill-intended, seemed in poor taste, and a reply might have encouraged her to believe that, in some measure at least, he condescended to discuss his inner life with her. He departed rapidly, but with hauteur. The moon was up, but shade trees were thick along the sidewalk, and the hauteur was invisible to any human eye. Nevertheless, William considered it necessary. Jane's friendly but ill-chosen "anyway" had touched doubts already annoying him. He was certain to be late to the party, so late, indeed, that it might prove difficult to obtain a proper number of dances with the sacred girl in whose honor the celebration was being held. Too many were steeped in a sense of her sacredness, well he wot, and he was unable to find room in his apprehensive mind for any doubt that these others would be accursedly diligent. But as he hastened onward his spirits rose, and he did reply to Jane, after all, though he had placed 100 yards between them. "Yes, and you can bet your bottom dollar I will, too," he muttered between his determined teeth. The very utterance of the words increased the firmness of his decision, and at the same time cheered him. His apprehensions fell away, and a glamorous excitement took their place, as he turned a corner and the music burst more loudly upon his tingling ear. For there, not halfway to the next street, the fairy scene lay spread before him. Spellbound groups of uninvited persons, most of them colored, rested their forearms upon the upper rail of the Parchers' picket fence, offering to William's view a silhouette like that of a crowd at a fire. Beyond the fence, bright forms went skimming, shimmering, wavering over a white platform, while high overhead the young moon sprayed a thinner light down through the maple leaves, to where processions of rosy globes hung floating in the blue night. The mild breeze trembled to the silver patterings of a harp, to the sweet barbaric chirping of plucked strings of violin and cello, and swooned among the maple leaves to the rhythmic crooning of a flute. And all the while, from the platform came the sounds of little cries and girlish voices, and the cadenced shuffling of young feet, where the witching dance music had its way, as ever and forever, with big and little slippers. The heart of William had behaved tumultuously the summer long, whenever his eyes beheld those pickets of the Parchers' fence, but now it outdid all its previous riotings. He was forced to open his mouth and gasp for breath, so deep was his draught of that young wine romance. Yonder, somewhere in the breathtaking radiance, danced his queen with all her court about her. Queen and court, thought William, and nothing less exorbitant could have expressed his feeling. For 17 needs only some paper lanterns, a fiddle, and a pretty girl, and Versailles is all there. The moment was so rich that William crossed the street with a slower step. His mood changed, and exaltation had come upon him, though he was never for an instant unaware of the tragedy beneath all of this worldly show and glamour.
It was the last night of the divine visit. Tomorrow the town would lie desolate, a hollow shell in the dust, without her. Miss Pratt would be gone, gone utterly, gone away on the train. But tonight was just beginning, and tonight he would dance with her. He would dance and dance with her. He would dance and dance like mad. He and she, poetic and fated pair, would dance on and on. They would be intoxicated by the lights, the flowers, and the music. Nay, the flowers might droop, the lights might go out, the music cease, and dawn come. She and he would dance recklessly on. A sense of picturesqueness, his own picturesqueness, made him walk rather theatrically as he passed through the groups of humble onlookers outside the picket fence. Many of these turned to stare at the belated guest, and William was unconscious of neither their low estate nor his own quality as a patrician man about town in almost perfectly fitting evening dress. A faint, cold smile was allowed to appear upon his lips, and a fragment from a story he had read came momentarily to his mind. Through the gaping crowds, the young Augustan noble was borne down from the Palatine, scornful in his jeweled litter. An admiring murmur reached William's ear.
Oh, honey, look at him long-tail suit. 'At's a rich boy, honey."
"Yes'm, so. Bet he got his pockets packed full of $20 gold pieces right this minute."
"You right, honey."
William allowed the coldness of his faint smile to increase, to become scornful. These poor sidewalk creatures little knew what seethed inside the alabaster of the young Augustan noble. What was it to them that this was Miss Pratt's last night, and that he intended to dance and dance with her on and on? Almost sternly he left these squalid lives behind him and passed to the festal gateway. Upon one of the posts of that gateway there rested the elbow of a contemplative man, middle-aged or a little worse. Of all persons having pleasure or business within the bright enclosure, he was that evening the least important, being merely the background parent who paid the bills. However, even this unconsidered elder shared a thought in common with the Augustan now approaching. Mr. Parcher had just been thinking that there was true romance in the scene before him. But what Mr. Parcher contemplated as romance arose from the fact that these young people were dancing on a spot where their great-grandfathers had scalped Indians. Music was made for them by descendants, it might well be, of Romulus, of Messalina, of Benvenuto Cellini, and around behind the house, waiting to serve the dancers with light food and drink, lounged and gossiped grandchildren of the Congo, only a generation or so removed from dances for which the chance stranger furnished both the occasion and the refreshments. Such, in brief, was Mr. Parcher's peculiar view of what constituted the romantic element. And upon another subject, preoccupying both Mr. Parcher and William, their two views, though again founded upon one thought, had no real congeniality. The preoccupying subject was the imminence of Miss Pratt's departure. Neither Mr. Parcher nor William forgot it for an instant. No matter what else played upon the surface of their attention, each kept saying to himself underneath, "This is the last night, the last night. Miss Pratt is going away tomorrow." Mr. Parcher's expression was peaceful. It was more peaceful than it had been for a long time. In fact, he wore the look of a man who had been through the mill, but now contemplated a restful and health-restoring vacation. For there are people in this world who have no respect for the memory of Ponce de Leon, and Mr. Parcher had come to be of their number. The elimination of William from his evenings had lightened the burden. Nevertheless, Mr. Parcher would have stated freely and openly to any responsible party that a yearning for the renewal of his youth had not been intensified by his daughter's having as a visitor, all summer long, a howling belle of 18 who talked baby talk even at breakfast and spread her suitors all over the small house and its one veranda from 8 in the morning until hours of the night long after their mothers, in Mr. Parcher's opinion, should have sent their fathers to march them home. Upon Mr. Parcher's optimism the effect of so much unavoidable observation of young love had been fatal. He declared repeatedly that his faith in the human race was about gone. Furthermore, his physical constitution had proved pathetically vulnerable to nightly quartets, quintets, and even octets on the porch below his bedchamber window, so that he was wont to tell his wife that never, never could he expect to be again the man he had been in the spring before Miss Pratt came to visit May. And, referring to conversation which he almost continuously overheard, perforce, Mr. Parcher said that if this was the way he talked at that age, he would far prefer to drown in an ordinary fountain and be dead and done with it than to bathe in Ponce de Leon's. Altogether, the summer had been a severe one. He doubted that he could have survived much more of it, and now that it was virtually over, at last, he was so resigned to the departure of his daughter's lovely little friend that he felt no regret for the splurge with which her visit was closing. Nay, to speed the parting guest, such was his lavish mood, twice and thrice over he would have paid for the lights, the flowers, the music, the sandwiches, the coffee, the chicken salad, the cake, the lemonade punch, and the ice cream. Thus did the one thought divide itself between William and Mr. Parcher, keeping itself deep and pure under all their other thoughts. Miss Pratt is going away, thought William and Mr. Parcher. Miss Pratt is going away tomorrow. The unuttered words advanced tragically toward the gate in the head of William at the same time that they moved contentedly away in the head of Mr. Parcher. For Mr. Parcher caught sight of his wife just then, and went to join her as she sank wearily upon the front steps. "Taking a rest for a minute?" he inquired. "By George, we're both entitled to a good long rest after tonight. If we could afford it, we'd go away to a quiet little sanitarium in the hills somewhere, and—" He ceased to speak, and there was the renewal of an old bitterness in his expression as his staring eyes followed the movements of a stately young form entering the gateway. "Look at it," said Mr. Parcher in a whisper. "Just look at it." "Look at what?" asked his wife. "That Baxter boy," said Mr. Parcher, as William passed on toward the dancers. "What's he think he's imitating? Henry Irving? Look at his walk." "He walks that way a good deal lately, I've noticed," said Mrs. Parcher in a tired voice. "So does Joe Bullitt, and—" "He didn't even come to say good evening to you," Mr. Parcher interrupted. "Talk about manners nowadays. These young—" "He didn't see us." "Well, we're used to that," said Mr. Parcher. "None of 'em see us. They've worn holes in all the cane-seated chairs. They've scuffed up the whole house, and I haven't been able to sit down anywhere downstairs for 3 months without sitting on some damn boy. But they don't even know we're alive. Well, thank the Lord it's over after tonight." His voice became reflective. "That Baxter boy was the worst, until he took to coming in the daytime when I was downtown. I couldn't have stood it if he'd kept on coming in the evening. If I'd had to listen to any more of his talking or singing, either the embalmer or the lunatic asylum would have had me, sure. I see he's got hold of his daddy's dress suit again for tonight." "Is it Mr. Baxter's dress suit?" Mrs. Parcher inquired. "How do you know?" Mr. Parcher smiled. "How I happen to know is a secret," he said. "I forgot about that. His little sister Jane told me that Mrs. Baxter had hidden it or something so that Willie couldn't wear it. But I guess Jane wouldn't mind my telling you that she told me especially as they're letting him use it again tonight. I suppose he feels grander than the King of Siam." "No," Mrs. Parcher returned thoughtfully. "I don't think he does just now." Her gaze was fixed upon the dancing platform, which most of the dancers were abandoning as the music fell away to an interval of silence. In the center of the platform there remained one group, consisting of Miss Pratt and 5 orators, and of the orators the most impassioned and gesticulative was William. "They all seem to want to dance with her all the time," said Mrs. Parcher. "I'd heard her telling one of the boys half an hour ago that all she could give him was either the 28th regular dance or the 16th extra." "The what?" Mr. Parcher demanded, whirling to face her. "Do they think this party's going to keep running till day after tomorrow?" And then, as his eyes returned to the group on the platform, "That boy seems to have quite a touch of emotional insanity," he remarked, referring to William. "What is the matter with him?" "Oh, nothing," his wife returned. "Only trying to arrange a dance with her. He seems to be in difficulties." End of chapter 25.